Israel, welcome to Tel Megiddo. I guess you've been here before.
Right, wonderful to be here. Thanks, Matt, and welcome you too.
Thanks.
I remember the day that you came for the first time in 1998. You were a student, and since then, we had a long and very fruitful way together.
Yeah, it's almost 25 years.
Absolutely.
It's crazy to think about. We're here in the Jezreel Valley, which is, of course, a very important place for archaeology in general. But more specifically, we're at the foot of Tel Megiddo, one of the most important archaeological sites in the region. Geographically speaking, we're, of course, just next to the Manasseh Hills on the west side of the valley at a very strategic point where we have the intersection of roads, we have access to water, and that probably says something about the importance of the site.
Sure. So first of all, we need to say a few words about, the identification of the site. How do we know that we are sitting here at Megiddo? Because in many places in the land of Israel, the names in Arabic preserve the old name from, either Bible or other historical texts.
Right.
At Tel Megiddo, this is not the case. The site is called in Arabic Tel al-Mutasallem, which means the Tel of the governor.
Okay.
And it makes sense because it is an important place. However, we know that this must be Megiddo because of the game in the entire valley. When you think about Megiddo, when you're going into the details of the references in historical records, in fact, and compare to other sites and consider the major tales in the valley, there's no other way but to identify Megiddo with the Tel al-Mutasallem, and this is indeed the identification which has been accepted from the beginning of research. And Megiddo is important not only because it sits on plenty of water and the fertile valley, it is also located on the international road, which comes from Egypt, crosses the hills behind us and goes into the valley. So the place is located in a not only strategic but very sensitive spot along the road. And from here you can take either a turn to the left, go to the north to Phoenicia, or cross the valley, go to Damascus, go to Mesopotamia, go to Anatolia. So we are on the main highway of the ancient Near East. And indeed, because of the combination of all these factors, Megiddo is mentioned in all great records of the ancient Near East. Tell us a little bit about it.
Sure, that's right. We start to see Megiddo appearing already in Egyptian records, in particular the famous Battle of Megiddo, which is really an amazing text. Thutmose III, Pharaoh of the New Kingdom, he tells us in great detail about his campaign to conquer Megiddo. It goes through a lot of detail about the geography of the site, what he did when he got here, how he had to lay siege to the city itself and for how long. And of course, he's victorious and is able to take all sorts of booty back to Egypt and make these offerings to the god Amun, which is, of course, why he's writing these texts. He's bragging to the god that he's done his job. But also, we get a lot of other Egyptian texts from not too long later. In the Amarna letters in Egypt, the diplomatic correspondence between the kings of the city-states here and their pharaonic overlords in Egypt, we must have several letters from the king of Megiddo to his pharaonic overlord and vice versa. In fact, from these letters, we learn quite a bit about how Egyptian rule functioned, and we even learn the name of one of the kings. His name is Biridia. In fact, we'll have an opportunity to talk about him in a little more detail.
We'll get back to Biridia, exactly. More than once, I think.
That's right. We also have Hittite texts. I think we have one. Is that right?
One, yes, exactly. And then we have, of course, the Assyrian records.
Right. The Assyrian records referring to Megiddo. The Assyrians, of course, conquering Megiddo.
The center of a province of Megiddo. And then, of course, the Bible. There's a lot in the Bible. Megiddo is, for a place located away from Jerusalem. I mean, there's no wonder that places near Jerusalem are mentioned many times, like Bethel and other sites. However, for a place which is located away from Jerusalem and the immediate vicinity of Judah, this place is mentioned many times in the Bible in regard of several very important figures, such as, King Solomon and King Josiah and others. We will have the chance to discuss each and every one of them. So altogether, we have really the full record. I think, Matt, that this is the only place in the region, I suppose the only place is at least in the Levant, which is mentioned in all the great records, extra biblical of the Bronze and Iron Ages, and in the Bible.
Yeah, that's right. I suppose it's no wonder then, with all these references, that Megiddo's enjoyed excavation for some 120 years, almost
I
continuously.
suppose the most excavated site here in this land.
Yeah, that's right. So who was the first to come here?
The first was the German excavator Gottlieb Schumacher. He was a very interesting fellow. He was born in the United States to a German Templar family. He was part of the Templar community then in Palestine of the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. They lived in Haifa, and the Schumacher house is known in the lower city of Haifa. And he excavated here between 1903 and 1905, and we know exactly the date when he started. Now, archaeology then was at its infancy. However, Schumacher was a good engineer and an architect, so he knew exactly what he was doing regarding understanding the architecture at least, and also a little bit about stratigraphy. He divided his finds into 8 main layers, and in fact, he gave us some sort of a good beginning for the exploration of Megiddo. The finds of the Schumacher excavations are in Berlin, in the Fortifications Museum. So whoever goes to Berlin can see the finds there in the basement. And this was the beginning. The next main excavation is already a very different story. The amazing undertaking of the University of Chicago in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, the story of the Chicago excavations is amazing in itself. I mean, it was funded by Rockefeller, after all. They had lots of money, lots of support for the United States. I think, if I remember correctly, one of the first paved roads in Palestine was paid for by Rockefeller from Haifa to the Tell of Megiddo, just so Rockefeller could visit.
And they constructed the houses of the
there's
expedition.
There's a mansion here for their excavation house. But that's great. But their work has been hugely influential on the development of archaeology in this region. They excavated so much of the Tell that the complete chronology of the site is fairly well known from their excavations in all of the different periods. So it has already given us a base, this Chicago excavations, for understanding all of the southern Levant. William Foxwell Albright, for example, would visit the excavations here while Chicago was digging, and he was thrilled to be able to see all of the pottery and material culture coming out in all of these different layers. And Megiddo, in his mind, as well as everyone else's later on, formed the basis for all of the terminology we use today: early bronze, middle bronze, late bronze, Iron Age, and so on. So the Chicago excavations certainly had that legacy. They also excavated quite a number of major monuments here at the site. Megiddo has a lot of monuments, so they couldn't miss them. But many of them are still standing today and form the basis for any visit to Tel Megiddo. And I think our own discussion over these next few episodes is really going to focus on a lot of these monuments.
Absolutely, yes. So this was the University of Chicago. I'm always amazed when I go up the site after so many years that I'm here, and I'm looking around and I'm telling myself, what's going on here? They managed to take slices out of the Tell. Well, first they peeled off some of the layers, and then they took slices. And when I go up and I look at it, I'm saying to myself, how long it would take us, Matt, you and me, to do the same? And I say to myself, probably 1,000 years.
I think that's my calculation.
Yeah, something like that. So this is amazing.
Well, I think despite as much as they've excavated, I mean, as we'll see, giant pieces of cake out of the Tell, there's always still something new to find here. Sure. When Yadin was here, he found all new monuments that Chicago didn't even know about.
Yeah, sure. And I think that we need to say, first of all, to give compliments to our predecessors, which means Schumacher was a good excavator for his time. The University of Chicago came here with great scholars, researchers. They knew what they were doing for their time in the 20s and 30s. And then came Yigael Yadin. Yigael Yadin, the celebrated Israeli archaeologist, from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He came here after excavating Chatzor, and he had questions in order to try to understand the Iron Age, questions of how to make the correlation between Chatzor and Megiddo. And he was the one who developed the idea, another idea, I would say, of Solomonic, especially Megiddo. So the spotlight was on the Iron Age, the spotlight was on the traditional biblical archaeology of the days of Solomon, and Yadin was a very brilliant man. When I came to study archaeology here in Israel, and Yadin's theories about Hatzor and Megiddo and Gezer correlated with the famous biblical passage in the first book of Kings, chapter 9. This was the foundation for the archaeology of the Iron Age, and he was active here. I mean, it was a fascinating work. He uncovered some of the monuments, as you said, and this was really a very important step in the exploration of Megiddo.
Right. So with his work and Chicago's work and Schumacher's work, what were you thinking when you started a new project at Megiddo in the 1990s?
That's a very good question, my dear Matt, because, I knew exactly what I was doing and what I was coming for. But now when I reflect back 28 years, 40, not every year, every second year, 14 seasons at Megiddo, because I'm doing other things, 1 zillion other things in the same time. But the idea was very pretentious. The idea was Megiddo is the centerpiece of the archaeology of this land for the Bronze and Iron Ages, and we'll hear in a minute beyond this land for the entire part of the world here. So we need to use modern methods in order to put some order in the stratigraphy and chronology. I mean, there was order, but to recheck the stratigraphy and chronology with as I mentioned, with new methods, because every single problem in the history and in the archaeology of the land of Israel in the Bronze and Iron Ages started here at Megiddo. It was like the switchboard of all problems here in one small place, in the Jezreel Valley. So my idea was the following. First of all, to recheck the entire stratigraphy of the site, and I could even dream about it because we could do the rechecking in different places because the belly, so to speak, of the mound had already been opened for us by the University of Chicago. So we could do section by section the entire sequence, right? And then to deal with with chronology. So this was the first. The second one was, and I did this in the beginning with my friend and colleague, David Yosishkin, who was here with me. He was the co-director for the first part of the excavations until 10 or 12 years ago. And so rechecking the entire stratigraphy. Secondly, the idea was to recheck monuments. There were wonderful monuments that were excavated by Chicago. The idea was to recheck them and find out about their date and so on. And then also to make Megiddo a laboratory for new methods and techniques in archaeology. Megiddo, in fact, has always been the laboratory. Even for the time of Schumacher and even for the time of the University of Chicago, you may remember, Matt, they flew their balloon, First aerial photography of archaeology was undertaken here at Megiddo. So we also decided to come with our own methods and more slowly into the exact and life sciences and their support of archaeology. We will speak in this series quite a lot about this. So these were the main targets of the excavations. When I think about it now, I say to myself, were you crazy? How dared you to ask such big questions and even dream that you'll be able to fulfill them? How dare you in 1994 to do this? And here we are sitting here in 2022, and we are almost there.
Yeah, I guess you had some chutzpah.
Okay, mate, so many excavations.
Yeah, Megiddo is really a unique site. I mean, look behind us. You're looking at a city gate from the late Bronze Age. No, you're looking at 12 city gates from the Middle Bronze, Late Bronze, Iron Age. We have everything. We have huge monuments stacked on top of one another. The entire history of the tell is wide open and exposed to us. There are some 30 major layers here, stretching from the early Bronze Age to through the Persian period. And this is really a unique site with unique opportunities.
A unique laboratory.
That's right.
This year I became a little bit more blunt in my approach of how to present Megiddo vis-a-vis other sites. So I think when I say unique, I don't mean unique in the valley, and I don't mean unique in Israel, and I don't even mean unique in the Levant. This is a unique site in the ancient world. In the entire region that I know very well, I know Eastern Mediterranean, from Greece and Cyprus and Turkey, into the delta of Egypt, into these countries, Israel and the neighboring regions, the Levant, Syria, and Iraq in a way also, all the way to to Iran also. There's no site like this with a full record of the Bronze and Iron Ages. Now you could take me, my dear Matt, and put me, in some heck place in Syria and tell me, well, here is a pile of earth, a tell, everything is there. Okay, fine, fair enough, let's start excavating. Here, there's a tell with the full coverage, with the full sequence, excavated. Now, we have, the two of us, a very special way of treating the sequence at Megiddo, which makes it even more important in the entire ancient world. What I'm going to tell you now, and to tell the camera, of course, sounds straightforward, but it does not. We are working on first of all, establishing firm stratigraphy. We need to know for a certain layer the walls and the floors and what connects to what and so on, and what's below and what's above. Then we deal with the cultural assemblages, especially the ceramic assemblage on each floor, on each layer, which provides us with relative chronology. What comes first and what comes later. And then at Megiddo here, we have something really unique, which is a merciless bombardment of radiocarbon, seeking for radiocarbon samples. There's no bombardment. We are taking samples, organic samples for radiocarbon, carbon-14 dating. So right now, at the end of this season, we are in a situation that the entire sequence of Megiddo is radiocarbon dated. There is no site like this, definitely not in the ancient world, and I think not in the world. And the number of radiocarbon samples is amazing. And this is why Megiddo now is the ladder according to which everybody else must line up, which means this is it. We can provide scholars, all sorts of scholars, doing this, doing that, we'll speak about it later, with absolute dates, real dates for every layer, for every sample. And if there are places in Syria, or if there are places, let's say, in the Greek world, in the Greek world, they don't have chronology of themselves. They don't have Egyptian finds like we have. They don't have, other sources, and they don't do as much as radiocarbon testing as we do. So they also can line up with us according to Greek finds that are found in well-dated layers at Megiddo here. So Megiddo is really now a centerpiece for the entire ancient world.
Okay, let's take our viewers on a tour of all of these different layers.
Absolutely, with great pleasure. Hello, Matt.
Hi.
Our second clip.
All right.
In the first clip, we described, we gave a background to Megiddo, the location, the importance, strategic importance, a little bit about the history of excavations, mention of Megiddo in historical records, and then we described our own method. We have been working here for a long period of time together now, so we gave this introduction. And now we need to really dive into the archaeology and history of Megiddo step by step.
Okay.
And we start with the early days, with the early years. We know from the finds at Megiddo that settlement here started very early, probably in the Neolithic and the Chalcolithic, and we'll be speaking about it later. But the first major phase, also from the point of view of archaeology, of construction and what we find, is in the early Bronze Age. Give us some background to the early Bronze Age.
Sure. First, let me point out that we are here in what we call Area J, which is a very nice situation for me because I started here, my archaeological career began here some 20 years ago.
I remember exactly the spot.
That's right. So it's always nice for me to come back here, even though we've completely finished our excavations here. In fact, we're sitting inside one of the monuments that we addressed on several occasions, a major temple that we'll talk about in a little bit. But the early Bronze Age, I think we really need to understand this period in general before we describe the finds here, because the finds here have changed everything that we have thought about this period in this particular region. Near in school or you open your textbook, when we talk about the third millennium, that is roughly 3000 BC to 2000 BC, you will see that this is the period of the origin of states. And usually the origin of states is discussed in the context of Egypt, Mesopotamia. Right around 3000, Mesopotamia is developing these huge cities, Uruk, for example, building all sorts of monumental architecture. In Egypt, we're talking about the very first pharaohs, and across the third millennium, we see the Old Kingdom and the Pyramid Age and so forth. In general, I think the understanding of the southern Levant during this period has, especially within the context of these state-forming societies, has been understood as kind of a backwater. There's not a whole lot going on. There's some interaction with some of these places. And in fact, especially in the first part of this, the connection with Egypt is important. But we see that Egypt doesn't really maintain its interest in this particular area. And because of this change in Egyptian interest in the area, the academic point of view has always been, this is not a really happening place during the third millennium. Now, if we kind of zoom in a little bit more, there's a lot we can say, of course, about the early Bronze Age. We generally divide it up into three periods: early Bronze Age 1, 2, and 3. But those periods are very
The
different.
intermediate Bronze Age later.
Yes, we'll also talk
Of
about the
course.
intermediate Bronze Age, which is intermediate between the early Bronze and the middle Bronze.
Between the two urban periods.
That's right. That's right. Overall, I think most people would describe the early Bronze Age here as kind of the first urban phase of the region. And I think through discussion of some of the monuments here, we'll get a good sense of that.
Great. So the University of Chicago, they were in fact first of all, they opened all this for us.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
without them, we would not have been able to dive into the early Bronze Age from the surface, because in some places, the early Bronze Age is like, 15 meters down. So it's impossible. And they were kind enough to open the scene for us. And they were the first, in fact, to excavate and uncover these wonderful monuments from the early Bronze Age. Tell me a little bit about the University of Chicago and their finds.
Sure. I think the first point that you made is a really, really important one before we start to think about the early Bronze Age at Megiddo. Chicago exposed so much here of the inner, earlier parts of the tell that we will probably overemphasize Megiddo, in the sense that no other site in the region that became important and stayed important for thousands of years to become a giant tell, nobody can excavate there. I mean, without years and years and years of excavation. So Megiddo is really the only site that we have early Bronze Age remains, extensive early Bronze Age remains. So we'll come back to that as we
Especially for
talk
the
about it.
beginning of the early Bronze Age.
Absolutely.
For the early Bronze III, perhaps we have some.
We have a few other sites, that's right.
Sure.
So University of Chicago, they've excavated this particular area in two stages. The first stage was on the far eastern side, where they dug a not small trench all the way down to bedrock and achieved the full stratigraphy of the site.
Which is unbelievable to watch even today, to look at even today.
It really is. If you stand on the northern observation platform and look down into this and you see just all of Megiddo vertically before you, it's really impressive. And there they exposed the first remains of the early Bronze Age, in particular coming down first upon a palace-like structure, which dates to the early Bronze Age 3, and below that a small temple dating to the early Bronze Age 1. Now this small temple is rectangular in shape. It was entered from its long side, so it's often called a broad-room temple. It's very well known. If you open a textbook on the early Bronze Age, this is the temple that you will see. They were very happy with the results here, so they moved into the tell a little bit farther and tried to duplicate this again. Fortunately or unfortunately, World War II happened and they stopped excavation right as they got down to the middle Bronze Age 1 and started to remove it. Now, this is a huge opportunity for us, of course, because we could pick up where they left off and essentially duplicate the early Bronze Age stratigraphy. And that's more or less what we tried to do.
Before we dive into our own excavations and the results at Megiddo here, which, as you say, changed much of what we knew before about the site and beyond, I think that I wish to ask you the following question. Put for me, please, Megiddo in context of the Western Valley.
Good. Yes, for the early Bronze Age, we see a fairly interesting pattern of settlement in the Western Jezreel Valley. In fact, over all of the Jezreel Valley that kind of sets up the framework for what we're going to look at here. First of all, early Bronze Age 1 is arguably one of the most extensively settled periods in the entire Jezreel Valley. Dozens and dozens and dozens of sites. And this
We
is
speak a lot
very
about
special.
Iron Age and late Bronze and
Right.
so on, but the big thing is the early Bronze one.
Yeah, it's crazy that we don't have the same settlement pattern until the Roman period.
Yeah.
And really, I mean, we know just across the street from us to the east is a site we call Tel Megiddo East,
Which we excavated.
which we've excavated over 3 seasons. And it's essentially, it's so close that it really feels like it's part of Megiddo during the early Bronze Age 1. But there are probably 5 or 6 other sites within a few kilometers. And then if you zoom out, you just see dots representing sites all across the western Jezreel Valley.
I think because of the springs.
Yeah, that's
along,
right.
Along the fault in the Western Valley.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And new sites are being found every day. Just 2 weeks ago, they found a new early Bronze Age 1 site about 2 kilometers south of here, and another one just last year, just 3 kilometers
Interesting.
in the other direction. So it's everywhere. But things change very dramatically as we transition to the EB2/3 period.
From the beginning of the early Bronze to the major phase of the urban early Bronze.
That's right. Things change very dramatically. There are really only about 3, 4, maybe 5 sites, and they all have very distinctive features. They become fortified, as far as we can tell, and they become geographically located at specific points in the valley that seem to appear like they're controlling roads in and out. So there's Megiddo on the road to the west, there's Afula on the road to the east, there's Tanakh on the road to the south, and a few other smaller sites. But it's a much less densely settled period.
As far as I see this, I think that we need to speak now about 3 phases. In the history of the site in the 3rd millennium BC. We need to speak about the beginning, I suppose, and even break it into 2. The early Bronze 1, the very beginning of the early Bronze Age in the late 4th millennium BC, then the main phase, the main urban phase in the country, perhaps not so much important here, but still, of the early Bronze 2, 3, in the first half of the 3rd millennium, and then we have to say a few words also about the intermediate Bronze Age. This phase of break of urbanism in the second half of the 3rd millennium, that is to say between 2500 and 2000 BC. And then, of course, we'll continue with the Middle Bronze. So tell me a little bit, Matt, about the earliest temples which we excavated also. I mean, Chicago started, but we shed light on their date and layout of these earliest buildings.
Right. The 2 earliest temples that we have are sequential, and they date to the middle phase of the early Bronze Age 1b. So let's say roughly 3300, 3200 BC. They're fairly simple affairs. I mean, they're small in the sense that each is probably 5 meters by 10 meters. As I said before, they're entered on the long wall of a rectangle, so they're broad. They have inside flat stones, in one of them kind of up against the walls, and another one kind of down the axis of the building. These were once understood as pillar bases, and they could be, but we'll have reason to talk more about those when we get to the next phase here. In at least one of these phases of temples, there was an approach from the east along a stone pavement, and the pavement was actually very unique and very exciting because it has this graffiti on it. It's a little bit more than graffiti. It feels as informal as graffiti, but it seems to be tackling pretty esoteric subjects. There are some images of animals attacking other animals. There are images of humans doing ritual things, for lack of a better word. Some of them are dancing, some of them are holding interesting sticks or swords. In a couple of them, there's some image of a moon behind the person, and so forth. So you really get a sense that there's some sort of cultic activity related to the pavement as well as the buildings. It's worth also mentioning that there are some images on these stones that seem to parallel similar imagery in Egypt. And I don't think that's insignificant because it's exactly at this moment in time that we know Egypt is taking an interest in this area and even occupying parts of the southern coast of the
southern coast in the south, yes. Yes, this is extremely interesting. Of course, it has to do with the cult in the early Bronze 1b, but with all due respect to the early temples, the big story is the mammoth temple at Megiddo that we excavated. In fact, Chicago had only one wall of it,
That's right.
but we exposed it, and it's really an amazing building, a unique building in the entire ancient Near East, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Tell me about it.
Sure, I'd love to. This is my favorite topic.
I know.
So these earlier temples we were talking about, exposed by Chicago, when we arrived here in the 90s, we saw this curious feature. There's a wall overlying the back of one of these temples that disappears
below this
building that we see here.
Yeah.
And this was immediately interesting. Some small probes at first kind of tried to see some floors related to this piece of wall and determined that it was also early Bronze Age 1b, roughly 3000.
Yeah, here we are radiocarbon dated.
That's right. Radiocarbon at 3000 BC.
So we need to say that we are in a situation that we are here in the early Bronze, at early Bronze Megiddo, radiocarbon dated for both the mammoth building that we are going to speak about and this building. So the next phases, and in a way also including this one.
That's right. This is going to be kind of our first introduction to something that we'll come back to in every episode, the intensity of radiocarbon chronology that we have at Megiddo that really provides a backbone for our work, but should provide a backbone for excavations.
The ruler for the entire region.
That's right.
We are the ruler.
Right.
Okay, let's go back to the temple.
Right. So this particular piece of wall was of interest. We were able to date it almost immediately. But in order to see where this wall was going, we had to excavate within the standing monuments, the very important standing monuments that are on the brochure of the national park, right? These are monuments that every tourist comes to see. So we had to work very carefully in and among these later monuments, make our discoveries, and then put the earth back. So there's not a lot, unfortunately, to see of what we had done. But I will describe it for you in great detail.
And short.
And short. First, we were able to decipher over a couple of seasons that this piece of wall, in fact, continued for some 50 meters across the site.
Incredible.
And I should tell you that this is not just a regular wall. This thing is 3.5 meters wide. It's made of stone that no one person could carry, and stands in stone about as tall as me. On top of it, evidence for some mud bricks. So we know that the structure was even higher.
Sure.
We also saw in those first couple of seasons that it's not just one wall. There were 2 of these walls just like this and a third one that was slightly smaller. And in between them, parallel, by the way, in between them, the remains of thousands and thousands of bones.
Animal bones.
Animal bones, that's right.
In the corridors.
That's right. And not just garbage, like from dead animals. This was like fine meat. We're talking about the forelimbs of animals, the really meaty, juicy parts that everyone would love to eat. It was quite clear studying the remains that these were the remains of animal sacrifice.
The offerings.
Offerings, right. So this was our first clue, in addition to the fact that we were in an area that has temples both before and after, that we were dealing with a cultic structure. A few more seasons go by, and we're able to determine where the inside of the building is, and expose that. And what we found was one of the most shocking things that I can imagine, in the sense that we're in such a remote period of time. I couldn't believe the things that we were finding. And let me try to describe those for you. First of all, our overall understanding of the building is something that's 50 meters by 22 meters. It has corridors in the back that were probably parts of stairwells. In the main room, the sanctuary, we had these 12 huge basalt tables. Some of them are circular.
Beautifully cut.
Amazing. Some circular, some rectangular. The circular one that we were able to see was 1.6 meters in diameter, perfectly measured any way you check it. In the just off center, inside of the circular one, a bowl was carved, which was really surprising, and I think probably gives us one of our only clues to the type of things that were going on in this building. It's off center, so we suppose that something else sat on these tables and needed a liquid or something else to do with the bowl. Yeah. I know that's vague, but we don't have a lot of evidence for what.
Vague and creepy.
Vague and creepy. These tables are each about a ton each. And
And
what's
there's no basalt here.
no, you have to go well off the site to find the basalt, especially of this particular quality. Otherwise, as you can see from the images that we're showing you, the building is symmetrical. It has a central axis. It's also entered like a broad room style, like the earlier temples, but 7 times as big as the temple it replaced. Opposite the entrance was some kind of mud brick and stone altar, which is in
Where
fact
you started your
that's
career.
right.
I remember you very well.
The first 2 weeks of my excavation here as a volunteer, we came down upon this mud brick structure.
And
That
it's
was
well recorded in pictures.
That's right. More amazing, I would say, than the size of the thing, which let me just say right now is as big, if not bigger, than the biggest contemporary temples at Uruk in Mesopotamia. Other than that statistic, no other structure from that entire millennium even comes close. And some of the structures of later millennia are also dwarfed by this thing. So size is important, but it's not the most crucial thing here. We discovered that they were laying out this building in a very specific way. We were able to show that they were using a unit of measurement, 52.5 of our centimeters, but using that in blocks of 6. And these groupings of 6 were influential or in fact determined how the rest of the building was laid out and constructed. First of all, one of these modules was the width of the door and the width of the altar itself. So right along the axis. And then that sort of creates 2 conceptual wings of the building, each 7 modules by 7 modules, perfectly. Each of the basalt tables, 1 module apart from its neighbor and 2 modules from its other neighbor.
So everything is pre-designed.
Everything is pre-designed
very accurately.
Very accurately. When we take measurements on it, up to 2 centimeters maximum accuracy off.
Perhaps I need to just intervene here and
Please.
remind you, but you know very well that we did this archaeological investigation of the, 2 points. First, the archaeological investigation of the animal bones from the corridors, and I suppose that this is the most beautiful piece of evidence, detailed for behavior of people with animals bringing offerings to a temple in the entire region, in the ancient Near East, especially for the 3rd millennium BC, because we can specify which animals were brought, the age of slaughter, pieces which were preferred, as you did mention, how to get rid of the refuse exactly, and how the whole thing, the whole cycle of animals in a temple, we have the evidence from here, and this is really wonderful. I wish to ask you, Matt, tell me a little bit about the okay, you described, the structure of the building, but I wish to zoom out. Tell me a little bit about the significance of this huge temple for understanding the very early stage of urbanism, urban life, city-state formation, perhaps, in Canaan.
First of all, this temple is unique as far as we know so far. I hope it's not. When other sites are excavated, I hope that this becomes the common.
When the Messiah comes.
Right. Second, it stands out in a very strange way. We talked about all these other early Bronze Age 1 settlements that are everywhere, including one that was excavated over the last several years, not too far away in Asawir. Huge city, for lack of a better term, but the most boring city. It was just houses, all of the same shape, kind of rectilinear with kind of curving walls on the outside. That city is just chock full of these things. And all of these early Bronze 1 cities or towns look just like that, just a bunch of dwellings. But what I think is the interesting observation here is that we start to see that people are coming together into nucleated settlements. And I think that the temple here is showing what happens when you get a bunch of people together under one roof, so to speak, and some sort of authority begins to emerge.
Exactly.
That authority builds this.
Yes, exactly. I wish to be a little bit more blunt even and say that when you look at something like this and you ask the question, how did they build it? They had to bring people from the countryside. And the meaning is that they have to control the countryside, the villages. They have to cover for the production when they take the people out. So there's whole organization going on. And this is, in fact, in my opinion, the ultimate example and demonstration of city-state formation, which means control of a hub over the countryside. Hub with elite, a king perhaps, priests, controlling the countryside from Megiddo and managing people, managing manpower. This is exactly what urbanism is all about, right?
That's right. That's right.
And since there were other places like this in the vicinity somewhere else, so they were competing, and showing off their abilities and so on. We come to the point that this beautiful temple, really something absolutely unique, I would say, comes to an end.
Right.
So tell me a little bit about the end of this building.
Right. I'm going to give you my version. I know there might be some competing interpretations out there.
Mine, for instance.
Yours, for instance, and you're welcome to voice it, and we'll edit it out later.
Of course.
In my opinion, this process of urbanization comes to a head. And in the early Bronze Age 1, that urbanization and whatever authority is there is somehow centralized in the temple itself. The temple is abandoned. And by abandon, I mean it is given up in favor of a new layout of a city.
Right.
And this is really significant. Do you know what they replace the temple with? A palace. And there is a temple connected to this palace, but it's a tiny, tiny, tiny thing. So somehow in this transition to the next phase, from the EB1 to the EB2-3, the temple gets pushed down in favor
It's a change of concept,
palatial structure. And I think that is the big difference between the urbanization of EB1 and the urbanization of EB2. And in fact, I feel like there's a natural flow of things here. Everyone comes together around a temple, somebody takes control, and they become the new head honcho.
Yes, I agree fully to what you describe here. There is really a change in the layout and a change of concept of how temple-palace relationship should look. But there is another piece of evidence I just wish to mention that we brought here specialists because of pieces of evidence that we noticed dealing with scholars dealing with earthquakes in antiquity. And we have to remember that we are sitting here on the Carmel Fault. So we are sitting in a place which is sensitive to earthquakes. And there were pieces of evidence such as long cracks in walls and so on. And I think that there is some sort of evidence for the possibility, let me be a little bit cautious here, for the fact that the final blow for this huge, beautiful temple came from an earthquake.
Right. I think that the evidence for the earthquake could also be interpreted as evidence for the systematic dismantling of the building by the people who were going to replace it with a palace. But this remains open.
Sure. What happens next? There's a phase that we all describe as early Bronze II.
Right.
And radiocarbon results in recent years show us that it is relatively short, perhaps a century or something like that. What happens at Megiddo at that time?
This whole tripartite division of the early Bronze Age into 1, 2, and 3, this came as a formula by Omride and others who first devised it, and they adapted it from Aegean chronology, and I feel like we're too slavish to it.
Okay.
In my opinion, what we call the early Bronze Age 2 and the early Bronze Age 3 are not two different phases. And in fact, the radiocarbon chronology that you've just referred to has showed it's diminished the concept of the EB2 either to a very short period,
right,
or to a conceptual idea that's being used at some sites and not others.
And at the end of the day, it's basically something to do with pottery traditions.
Sure.
Ceramic traditions.
That's right.
Yeah. So this brings us to the last phase, here in the temple compound at Megiddo. Before it had been probably abandoned for a while, and this is the early Bronze III. Early Bronze III, after all, is a major phase in the history of the country. It goes, according to radiocarbon studies, we are speaking about 4 centuries between 2900 and 2500 BC, so significant. And we are sitting in a building which, according to some, belongs to this period, according to you, belongs to a phase after.
That's right.
So tell me, please, about the early Bronze III.
Great. So this is the period that we just referred to in which the temple complex is replaced by a palace. And we have a couple of different ways we can interpret the architecture here, but let's start just by saying that Chicago unearthed a palace on the edge of the mound, and as we excavated in this direction, we found what is probably the continuation of that palace, or at least an elite compound that is adjacent to and connected to it. It is marked by actually ortholinear streets and pathways with buildings off to the side that all seem to be connected together. And they seem, on one hand, to be houses, maybe elite houses, but on the other hand, also to show evidence of kind of strange activities. In one building, for example, we found dozens and dozens of fragments of small bowls that were used as lamps using a very distinct kind of fabric. What were they doing there? I don't know. In another building, we saw that the floor was paved with very bright red, shiny pottery that was imported from the Jordan Valley or the northern Jordan Valley. So some special things are going on here. In fact, over the course of these 4 centuries, we see that these buildings are all rebuilt roughly 3 times. As I said before, we also do have a small temple that is connected to them, and adjacent to this temple, a round altar.
This is the famous round altar.
Famous
Megiddo.
altar.
Absolutely.
That's right. Yeah, you can all see it if you come here and stand in the northern observation platform.
Right. So and then all this what you described to me as the early Bronze III city is sealed by a layer which is really very beautiful, and we are in fact sitting in it.
That's right.
And these are the 3 temples. They look alike. They are in the same layout. Huge temples also, beautiful ones with a big hall and with the pillars in the center and entrance in front and the altar in the back.
Right.
And they are, as I mentioned, similar. So this is a compound of 3 temples, and they are relatively well built. And the question is how to date them. So here we come to a point where the 2 of us, are disputed, which is okay. I mean, we are not speaking about a Stalinistic system that we have all have to agree about everything. So in my opinion, we are dealing here with the last phase of urban activity of Canaan, let's say around 2500 BC, the very last phase of the early Bronze III, when the urban life still continues in a way. You have a different point of view.
That's right. First of all, there's a major break here. The palace system is completely put out of commission and replaced by this huge complex of 3 temples. The entire cultic area is covered by this. On the eastern side, it is approached by this monumental staircase that comes up to meet the temples as well. So I think, first of all, that this break in use of space is significant. Second, we were able to find, I should also remind the viewers that this was completely excavated by Chicago, and we were able to add a few loci. But
and this is
really
why we are disputed, because we don't see the material on the floor.
That's right. In fact, this might be, as of today, the only phase that is not radiocarbon dated in our entire sequence. But we'll fix that.
Yeah. So let's we are coming to the end of this conversation, and we need to say a few words about what happens at Megiddo in the 5 centuries after the urban phase. So according to you, these buildings are from the intermediate Bronze Age,
right.
Perhaps the beginning of the period, I suppose. And in any event, there is some sort of a gap. In your opinion, perhaps 3 centuries. In my opinion, perhaps a longer one. We don't really see full sequence of activity. We see burials on the slope. We see burials here even coming from above and penetrating into some of the buildings from the intermediate Bronze Age. But generally speaking, there is a break in urban life for at least several centuries in the late 3rd millennium, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think that's a fitting end to this discussion, is that whatever these triple temples, whatever you want to date them to, there's clearly an end of activity here and some sort of gap before we get to the Middle Bronze Age. And I think we're really seeing the end of that first urban experiment of the early Bronze Age, of the 3rd millennium. And it'll be interesting to try to discuss how Megiddo recovers from this.
Absolutely. And this is the next phase of our discussion.
That's right.
Thank you, Matt. So, Matt, we are back to the field now to speak about the Middle Bronze Age. And we picked up a wonderful location because people behind us are working. We are in real time. This is the Middle Bronze Age. And I'll tell you a secret which you know very well. We are sitting now on top of the city wall, brick city wall of the Middle Bronze Age. But before going to details, I wish to say a few words to connect to what we said before in this series on Megiddo. We spoke after the introduction about the 3rd millennium BC, about the first wave of urbanism in the early Bronze, and then and monumentality also, possibly first city-states. Then about the crisis in the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, between 2500 and 2000 BC. There was some sort of a crisis, no urban culture in the entire region of the southern Levant. And now we are sitting here in order to discuss the re-emergence of urban life in Canaan. And in fact, we open now 2 talks, one on the Middle Bronze and one on the Late Bronze, which cover the continuity in the Late Bronze Age also. Because from the Middle Bronze to the Late Bronze until the collapse of urban life in the crisis here, about 1,000 years later, from the beginning, this is one chunk in the history of Canaan. And I think that when we speak about the Middle Bronze, we need to remember several facts. First of all, that we are definitely here into a scene of city-states, and we can really identify the important in the valley city-states next to Megiddo, Shimron, for instance, a little bit to the north of us, as an example. This is the first thing. And the second item, when we zoom out a little bit, this is the first period when we have records on Canaan, written records. Several of them, the most well-known perhaps the execration text from Egypt, which come from the Middle Bronze Age, from the early phases of the Middle Bronze Age. So having said that, I'm turning to you, Matt, and I'm asking you, tell us a little bit about Megiddo in the Middle Bronze Age, some sort of a background.
Sure. Megiddo in the Middle Bronze Age is not unlike the Megiddo in the Early Bronze Age in the sense that it's fabulous. It's huge. What really characterizes this period in terms of the monuments that have been excavated are huge fortifications, big city gates, multiple fortification walls, really dense accumulation of habitation remains over a long period of time. And one of the main phenomena that we have excavated are burials. In this point in time, burials of your family members under the floor of your house becomes common tradition. And so we know a lot about dead people during this particular period.
And they tell us a lot. When you investigate dead people, you can really, from them, learn a lot about the society. And we'll speak about it in a minute. But
Good.
before we do this, I wish to ask you the following question. When, in your opinion, was Megiddo fortified for the first time in the Middle Bronze Age?
I'm glad you asked, because that's one of the things that we've been wrestling with of late. In Area S, which is on the other side of the tell from where we are now, that is the main entrance to the site itself, the city gates. It's really difficult to give a pinpoint answer right now, but we're getting closer and closer. And the answer is really surprising. It's very, very early in the Middle Bronze Age 1 period, somewhere not long after 2000 BC, based on the radiocarbon dates that we put together so far.
So this would be one of the first places in Canaan to be fortified when urbanism comes back. So in the very beginning of the 20th century. So this is a bit before, the conventional wisdom about the beginning of the fortifications. And so this is a kind of surprise.
Yeah, I would say it's almost earth-shattering, because I think the normal narrative for this period is somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, say 1950, people start to come back to these sites. They build small villages, small communities, which grow in complexity and then build fortifications some generations later. But here it really looks like Megiddo, bam, becomes an urban center again in a very, very short time.
And there is difference, I want to ask you about it. There is difference between the two main areas where we are operating. We are here in Area K. This is the southeastern sector of Megiddo, but we are working also in the northwestern sector. And the picture is not the same, right?
Yeah, it's much more complicated on the other side, and there's some good reasons for that. First of all, we're at the back of the city, so to speak, now. And as far as we know, Megiddo only had one entrance, and that was on the north side. So we're very much on the south side, as far away from that as possible. And here, the story is not uncomplicated either. It's a couple of large city walls, maybe even a third earlier one that we're just coming up today, ringing the city. And it's sort of straightforward. We have a big city wall, they rebuild it or they expand it and so forth. In Area S, where the gates are, it's far more complicated. We see at least 5 major monumental rebuildings of
Which
the
is
entrance
amazing.
to the city.
I have never seen anything like that in my career.
That's right. Just in the first, say, century of the Middle Bronze Age. It's nuts.
And I would like to mention that also the preservation is unique here. Quite surprising. We are sitting now on top of the Middle Bronze Age fortification. I mean, we are sitting on top of a brick wall, 5 meters thick, and very impressive one. On this side behind me, the city wall still stands now something like 4 meters high, and 1 meter is missing, so like 5 meters high. Preservation 4,000 years later, bricks.
That's right.
Which is really, I mean, I'm kind of surprised is a small word to describe what I feel when I look at this preservation of the fortification.
But what are they for? I mean, I know we call them fortifications, but that it just seems like overkill.
Yes, this is something which has bothered me for many years. You know, I excavated many years ago at Shiloh, which is a smaller site than Megiddo, and a little bit later in the Middle Bronze, but still monumental to the extent that you ask questions. You know, what is this for? Who were the people who did this and why? We have to admit that we don't really have the full answer because we are in a period where we already have records, but not really descriptions, that can shed light on complex questions like this. But I would say the following. First of all, we need to assume that the country was divided into city-states. And they were fighting over fertile land, over water, over pasture land, and things like this, over, what is the last village from here paying tax to this king, and what is the first village over there on the horizon paying tax to another king. So probably there was animosity between the city-states, and they were protecting themselves against possible attacks by, a nearby city-state. I don't see a big enemy from the outside, like, Middle Kingdom Egypt attacking, with military. Not on an ongoing way. Maybe a single event could have happened, but this was not the reason. The second thing that we need to bear in mind, which does not confirm with the way, or maybe yes, people think today, there's a lot of prestige in this. Think about the situation. There's this petty king of Megiddo, and there's this petty king of Shimron, not so far from here, maybe 20 kilometers away, and they basically hate each other. And they are envy of each other. And each one wants to boast and say, well, I'm stronger, I'm more important. So they express their importance by this monumentality, by this prestige. I can construct bigger fortifications than you. I can build bigger palaces. I can give a better temple to the god. Whatever god was worshipped there. So there is also this thing of prestige involved with the daily practice of life. The two of them need to be considered.
It's interesting, I mean, to think of these both of these terms. What's really strange about Megiddo is how much the city built up inside these walls.
Unbelievable.
Right? It's like they put this wall around the city and it became a donut that the city just built up into. And within 100 years, the houses are being built on top of the city wall.
We are not used to this, and even when we travel to Europe today and we go to visit, a cathedral from the 12th century BC. So we are 800 years or more later, and there is a difference of maybe a meter and a half.
Yeah.
And here you look at Megiddo, and I mean, I am really stunned when I look at the evidence, because here behind us, there is an accumulation, I think we both agree, of about perhaps 5 meters of layers. And I think I counted something like 7 or 9. I'm not going to start counting again. Layers, strata, one on top of the other, in a period of time which is relatively limited. We are speaking only about the first half of the second millennium BC, which means the Middle Bronze starts probably around 2000 BC, perhaps a little bit later, a few years later, and continues until supposedly the middle of the 16th century, which means 1550. And when we say middle bronze, late bronze, the viewers need to understand that we are speaking about material culture, basically, and shape of pottery and so on. So this period is, 450 years,
Yeah.
and the city goes up 5 meters,
Yeah.
with 9 layers. So there was a lot of waste. There were many changes. Everything was built of bricks. Every time they wanted to renovate, they had to destroy the walls. So they pushed the bricks, they leveled everything, and they built again. And the city came up and up and up,
Yeah.
5 meters.
Halfway through this period, there were no fortifications per se. There was a cliff edge that was outside of the wall, but there were people living on top. The city was spilling over the top of it. It must have looked ridiculous.
So, Matt, we have spoken about the simple people living here in the backwater of the site,
Right.
far from the gate and from the main sector of the elite. But we are speaking about a city-state, so there must have been a temple here. There was a temple here,
Sure.
and the palace. So tell me a little bit about the monuments of Megiddo.
Yeah, there are many monuments from the Middle Bronze Age here, particularly outside of the city gate and the main monumental entrance itself. The eastern side of the site, which was the ancient holy place. We talked about it in the early Bronze Age.
Right.
They continued to find this area sacred, and they continued to build temples there. In particular, not too late into the Middle Bronze Age, they already constructed some sort of huge monumental tower temples, what we call them, because it has the facade as 2 big towers sticking out from the main sanctuary. This was really impressive structure that continued on in use all the way into the Iron Age almost. And it's big, almost totally excavated by the University of Chicago, so we haven't been able to check it ourselves, but it's very clearly starts in the
And it had
Bronze
been
Age.
removed by them.
Completely removed. Right next to this temple was a large palace. In fact, it kind of feels like the palace itself was encompassing the temple itself, like a sacred compound. So you kind of get the sense that royalty is somehow controlling the temple area itself. The palace is not shabby either. Just like this area, they rebuilt the palace at least 3 times before it moved to a different area at the very end of the Middle Bronze Age, and got enlarged there as well.
So this takes me to the question of demography, and I suppose that first of all, people would be interested to learn how many people lived in a place like this.
That's the big question everybody asks. Yeah.
It's a big question because we're speaking about monumental architecture, and you have just described to me a huge temple at Megiddo and the palace. How many people were here to build all this? So we need to tell the viewers that we are dealing with a site which could have been, in the Middle Bronze Age, together with the lower tell, perhaps 110 or 20 dunams, which means 10, 12 hectares altogether.
Yeah.
And if we calculate according to pre-modern societies, ethnographic formation on pre-modern societies, we can multiply by 200 per hectare. So if we are dealing with 10 hectares, perhaps 2,000 people, something like that.
Wow.
That's all. We are not speaking about a huge city, right?
Yeah.
But there were the villages in the valley in front of us, and there were many of them, we know from the surveys. So we are speaking in the moment that we have city-states, there's the hub of the king and the palace and the temple, and the people in the countryside, and they pay tribute and they pay tax and so on. So when they have to put them to work in order to construct a fortification like this, they can, as long as they can provide them with food, which means organized production,
Right.
Agricultural production, they can put them to work in the hub at the central site of Megiddo.
You mentioned early on that burials tell us a lot about the population. Any burials from the Middle Bronze Age that can help us here?
So yes, so this is really fascinating. Now we are turning, in the introduction conversation, we spoke about it, that we are trying to make Megiddo, a site where we test modern methods and techniques. And indeed, in the Middle Bronze, we can see this very clearly. So much of what we are doing regarding modern technologies and modern methods is related to the burials at Megiddo.
Okay.
So in the area behind us, there are many burials from the Middle Bronze Age. I'm speaking here about the beginning of the second millennium, of course. At that time, they buried, I think you mentioned it before in your words, that they buried their dead under the floors of the houses. And when we come across a burial like this, we work very carefully. And we carried out here two investigations which are really interesting to see things beyond the naked eye. I suppose to speak about microarchaeology, what we cannot see with the naked eye, but we see under a microscope,
Right.
so to speak. So the first one, there is this royal tomb, I mean elite tomb, that the two of us excavated 6 years ago in another area of the tell. And you remember that there were juglets in the tomb. There was gold and silver and what else? I mean, you name it. Really elaborate. And there were several people interred in the tomb. It's a stone structure, chamber, underground chamber, a very beautiful one, constructed also. And we took there were offerings, including small juglets, and we wondered what was offered in the small juglets. And today it is possible to do a study of molecular residues in containers, including ceramic containers. And we did that. Vanessa Linares led PhD student, led the work in that of the juglets at that tomb, and we were surprised to discover that they included vanilla. The content was
Wow.
also, I mean, including vanilla. Now, vanilla, where did it come
Some
from?
exotic.
Exotic, where did it come from? So, today vanilla is brought from Mexico, for instance, but we do not speak about, maritime connections between the ancient Near East and America in the middle of the second millennium. So apparently the vanilla came from the Far East, from perhaps the Malabar coast in India. So
Amazing.
this is an indication that the tomb is dated 1600 BC. And this is an indication that around 1600 BC, there were already contacts, not maybe necessarily one person walking, from the Malabar coast with a juglet, to Megiddo, but, with stations on the way to bring commodities from there, exotic commodities to the Levant. The second investigation is even more groundbreaking, I think, than this. This is the place where we conducted the first intensive ancient DNA project in Israel. I mean, especially for the Bronze and Iron Ages. So there are many samples here that were sent. I mean, when we speak about an investigation like this, it's not being done by me or by you. You cannot extract DNA, and I cannot do the mathematics of the mathematic manipulation. But the extraction was done at Harvard in the US by David Reich and his lab. The bioinformatics, which means the mathematic manipulation of the results, was done at the Hebrew U by Lilia Granat, Liran Carmel, and their team. And the result was very interesting. We discovered here that the population of second millennium Megiddo, and not one of them, all of them, the population of second millennium Megiddo, their genetic pool was composed of two components. The first one is what we described as Neolithic Levant, which means the population of the Levant running down from Neolithic times.
Okay.
And the second, most surprising, there is evidence for migration of people from the northeastern sector of the ancient Near East. In today's words, Caucasus,
Wow.
Eastern Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, northeastern Iran, this area of the ancient Near East. And we see them from the third millennium into the second millennium. Here we see them in the second millennium. And there are indications for these people also in the material culture of Canaan, and also in the record of names of petty kings of the late Bronze Age, somewhat later, because the name of the king of Megiddo, which you described to us in the opening clip, Biridia. This is not he does not carry a Semitic name, but rather a Hurite name from the far northeastern part of the ancient Near East. So this is really very, very interesting. We know a lot now about the population. Not only that, we can do a trick here because we work also with physical anthropologists. So we know about the age of death of these individuals, and we know about their sex. gender, male, female, and we know where they are. So now also we impose on this what we know from the DNA, first relation, second relation, and in fact, when you come to think of it, we can reconstruct the entire quarter of Megiddo and the relationship between the people in the Middle Bronze Age, let's say around 1700, 1600 BC.
Wow. Amazing.
If somebody told me this 20 years ago, I would not have believed.
The Middle Bronze Age takes us through to the middle of the second millennium, and we typically talk about the Middle Bronze followed by the Late Bronze Age. And these are archaeological terms that we use, of course, but they're sort of imposed on us from an historian's point of view. We have no major changes that we can see physically in the transition from the Middle Bronze to the Late Bronze Age.
Yes, Great Megiddo, not even a destruction.
That's right. But we know from historical sources that things do change, and they change big. We see the arrival of Egypt on the scene and the change in the dynamic relationships between local city-states and their imperial overlords. So next time.
Exactly. This is the topic of our next conversation.
Great.
Thank you, Matt.
All right.
Morning, Matt.
Morning.
Today we are speaking about the Late Bronze Age.
Right.
And we are sitting on this beautiful background of the Late Bronze city gates. Very well preserved, a little bit reconstructed, still very impressive.
Yeah.
I think that we need, first of all, to give some background. So the Late Bronze Age, we are speaking about the period of time between 1550, 1550 BC, as the beginning, the transition from the Middle Bronze Age, on which we spoke already, and the end of the Late Bronze Age, around somewhere in the late 12th century into the beginning, perhaps even as late as the beginning of the 11th century for Megiddo, already within maybe the beginning of the Iron One. So this is the chronological framework. And if I have to summarize the whole business of the Late Bronze Age in one sentence, it is relatively easy to differ from other periods, because we can speak about a system of Canaanite city-states ruled by petty kings, dominating villages in the countryside, each in their territory, but living under an Egyptian hegemony. Because for the period of time between somewhere in the middle of the 15th century until somewhere in the middle of the 12th century, for a long period of time, perhaps over 300 years, Canaan was under Egyptian domination, direct Egyptian domination. It was a province of the Egyptian empire of the New Kingdom. And another thing to say about the Late Bronze as some sort of an introduction is to mention that this is the first period for which we have really more historical information. I say more because there's a little bit also for the Middle Bronze Age, but in the Late Bronze Age, we will speak about it later. Historical information records coming basically from Egypt. So this is the background, and if now let's turn to Megiddo, and let me turn to you, Matt, and ask you, tell me a little bit about the layout of the site. How did Megiddo look like in the Late Bronze Age?
Good. Yeah, what we have to remember first is that the Late Bronze Age is very much a continuation of the Middle Bronze Age that we spoke about last time. And in particular, if you can remember the Middle Bronze Age fortification system with this big system of walls that goes all the way around the city. And we talked about the buildup of the city within those walls, such that by the end of the Middle Bronze Age, they're building houses on top of the city wall. And I think this is a really important thing to keep in mind for some of the discussions that we're going to have here. By the beginning of the Late Bronze Age, Megiddo probably looked like a muffin with a big wall around it, with the city kind of poking up over top and sitting on the top.
But to differ from what people used to say, maybe a generation ago, it is still fortified because the city wall of the Middle Bronze Age and the ramparts are still standing, and it's perhaps even better fortified because there are houses on top.
That's right. That's right. So the site is clearly fortified, but it's like living on a cliff fortification.
Right.
And that's important for understanding this gate as well. This gate and the plaza that we're sitting in is actually dug down at the beginning of the late Bronze Age into the underlying strata, into the underlying cake of this muffin, in order to provide an easier access from the lower city, that is down below, and the upper city, which is the majority of the tell. And so we're sitting in this plaza that is probably 4 or 5 meters below the floor levels of the buildings of the late Bronze Age next to us. In particular, to my right, you see this really massive wall that formed a terrace in this plaza to support a palace of the late Bronze Age. This palace of the late Bronze Age probably spanned, I don't know if it actually went over our heads and over the gate behind us, but it was on both sides of this plaza far above. Other features of the site more or less continue just as in the Middle Bronze Age. In the cultic area, there's a massive temple that was already in existence in the Middle Bronze Age and still functioning today. And around there and other parts of the site, the continuation of the domestic activity that we saw already in Area K in the Middle Bronze Age. The palace is really exceptional. I mean, when Chicago first started uncovering it, they found a few phases, 3 major phases, but the walls were standing 3 meters high. And inside, they found the remains of, for example, this cache of ivories, which is very iconic for Megiddo today.
Yeah.
That's right. You can see them, some of them at the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, and also some at the University of Chicago. And they represent Canaanite themes kind of twisted with an Egyptian spin, which I think very much represents the late Bronze Age here. Canaanite under Egyptian authority.
Yes, indeed. And this is also, I think the palace is also a demonstration of how archaeology looked like 90 years ago, something like that, 85, 90 years ago, because when they excavated it, after a while, they wanted to continue working and digging down below, so they simply removed the building. So this is one of the most beautiful edifices ever excavated, definitely in the land of Israel, definitely for the late Bronze Age, a beautiful building. There are even some hints that there were frescoes, on the walls. But this was, the 30s of the 20th century. Palestine of that time was not the center of the world, so to speak, if I can say so. And all this was lost because nobody could think then about, our century, living in 2022 and thinking about tourism today, people interested and so on. So this beautiful building just went down the dump.
I'm very happy it did, because our understanding of the Middle Bronze Age here at Megiddo really depends on seeing what was below that palace.
So maybe this is the moment to turn to chronology.
Okay.
I think to go into to zoom in on the chronology. So Megiddo is really the key site for establishing the chronology of the late Bronze in Canaan and beyond. And this is for several reasons. So we have recently conducted a study here of the different layers that we are excavating from the beginning of the late Bronze to the end. By the way, this terminology, Middle Bronze, Late Bronze, comes from basically typology of ceramics, right? I mean, otherwise, we could have said that the Late Bronze starts with the Egyptian hegemony in the 15th century, not in the 16th. But leave this aside, we carried out excavation here and exposed the layers, the floors and the buildings and so on in domestic areas where changes are faster than in a palace like this over here. And then, of course, we, as we mentioned in the beginning in our introduction talk, everything is radiocarbon dated, so we know well. And here we were able, first of all, to support one theory. That there has been some sort of a dispute recently on the transition from the Middle Bronze to the Late Bronze. And we were able to kind of put a verdict, so to speak, because of our work on radiocarbon. The transition is in the middle of this, around the middle of the 16th century. No less important is what we are doing at the end of the Late Bronze Age, because there is a destruction here. The palace here next to us was destroyed, and this is why it was so well preserved, because everything collapsed inside, and the building was really well preserved. Now, we always have a notion of a strike on a city, destruction, and end of the story, right? But here at Megiddo, we had a really unique chance to go into details, because we excavated this destruction layer or the latest phases of the late Bronze Age in different areas. And what we see all in all is that the city declined gradually. It took time. So there is one disturbance in the area of the palace, for instance, around 1200 BC. This is the typical or classical date for the end of the Bronze Age, but not really, because we can see later another disturbance in another area of the site, let's say in the 30s of the 12th century, 1130 or so. And this probably can be associated with the pullout of Egypt from Canaan in the days of Ramesses VI, the king of the 20th dynasty, the pharaoh of the 20th dynasty in Egypt. And then we have another place at the site where we have the real final act, showing us that the real final destruction is a bit later, around 1100 BC, or even slightly later, which means already in the Iron One, what we call the Iron One. It shows you how flexible we need to be when we think about history to differ from our own archaeological terminology. We are used to work in rubrics, late Bronze, Iron One, and so on. But it was a gradual process. And in fact, we see that Megiddo managed to survive a while after the pullout of Egypt. But the pullout of Egypt is really the end of the late Bronze Age and signifying, the main phase of the crisis years, because the end of Megiddo of the late Bronze Age is part of a much bigger picture of the collapse of civilization in the entire Eastern Mediterranean and the ancient Near East.
And of course, don't forget the Aegean chronology here. I mean, we have a lot of Aegean finds from throughout the late Bronze Age that tie very nicely into our stratigraphy, into our radiocarbon chronology. These are finds that in their homeland are not very well dated, mostly only through relative chronology. So here, Megiddo has this opportunity to dictate chronology to the rest of the Mediterranean world.
Right.
Tell us for a moment, because it's such an important part of the excavation here, the social life of these late Bronze Age folks.
Yes, social demography. I think first of all we need to. People are asking me always when I can take my friends, colleagues, visitors touring Megiddo. I'll take them around. They ask me how many people lived in a site like this. This is a question which always pops up, and rightly so. So I think that we need to mention that we are using some sort of a number to calculate number of people on an acre, according to what we know from ethnographic research on societies in recent history living in sort of antiquity conditions, let's put it this way. Okay. And altogether, we can think about if the site is 7 hectares, so we are speaking about something like a little bit over 1,000 people, about 200 people per hectare, perhaps in a hub of a city-state like this, with palaces and temples and so on, perhaps a little bit less because much was devoted to the public buildings. Over 1,000, but this does not mean that this is the whole story, because the petty king of Megiddo rules over the countryside. So there are villages, and we know the villages because we conducted a survey of the countryside, and we assemble information from salvage excavations and other surveys. So we know how the countryside looked like, and we can really reconstruct the picture of the Jezreel Valley with the central hubs, the city-states, and the countryside of each of them, of the small villages, under the rule of the central site. So this is first point to mention. The second point to mention is that we can really see in the finds the social status of the people. So evidently we are here near the palace. So the elite of the population, king and entourage, the family of the king and entourage, they lived here. Mm-hmm. And we also excavate in the backwater, so to speak, of Megiddo. And we can actually see this not only in architecture, let's say, that this is more elaborate here than in other parts of the site, a little bit away from here. We can see this in all sorts of finds, and this is thanks to the fact that our excavations, we are working in two major areas, one near the palace and another one far away from the palace, right, in the south eastern sector of the site, and we can compare the finds. So just to give an example for the viewers to see what archaeology, modern archaeology is like, we published, a work on the foodways in at Megiddo in the late Bronze and Iron I, comparing foodways, culinary practices around near the palace and back in the other area, according to the faunal finds, what people ate, I mean, the meat and so on. So we can see what portions of meat they took here and the portions that they took over there. We can see, the age of slaughter, because definitely, when you slaughter the sheep, goats, cattle in a younger age, you get a better meat, We can see all these details, and it's really fascinating that archaeology can prove this working in a site like this and working properly in more than one area, and having in mind these questions in advance. I want to mention another item for the late Bronze Age. Continuing from the Middle Bronze Age, we have evidence now from our ancient DNA studies about the population of Megiddo, and we see, you may remember that we spoke about the middle of the second millennium, at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, where the people of Megiddo, they have a genetic pool comprised of what we call the local Neolithic Levant and the incoming people from the northeastern, migrating from the northeastern sector of the ancient Near East, today's Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, Eastern Turkey, and so on, and mixing. So we have this mix here. This is the population of Megiddo and beyond, probably in the second millennium BC, and in the middle of the second millennium, and it continues into the second half, because we can see in the ancient DNA studies that there was still people migrating into the late Bronze Age, people newly coming
from the same region.
From the same region. It didn't stop, in the early Bronze or Middle Bronze, and then we have the genetic pool, but they were still coming in a later phase. So this is also important and interesting, and we know also from the linguistic side, basically, or not only, we know from the DNA, in fact, first to mention, that these people, the same people, having the mixture of the local DNA and the impact of the DNA of the Northeast, they are both the simple people of Megiddo, but also the ruling elite, because we see them also here around our royal tomb, if you remember, that we excavated in 2016 near the palace. So it is really interesting to see.
You see this linguistically also?
And linguistically, yes, because we have the names of the petty kings of Canaan in the Amarna. We'll speak about the Tel El Amarna tablets in a minute from now, from the 14th century BC, correspondence between the petty kings of Canaan and the Egyptians and the Pharaoh and the Egyptian administration in Canaan. And many of the names of the petty kings of Canaan, of these city-states, are Semitic, including, for instance, the name Abdichipa of the ruler of Jerusalem and others. However, there are several names which are not Semitic, and they are Hurrian, and they come from this area over there of the northeast of the ancient Near East, let's say Eastern Turkey. So the name of the king of Megiddo in the 14th century BC is Biridia, and Biridia is such a name. It's not a Semitic name. So we have here support from another angle, from the linguistics, for what we see in the DNA. So, Matt, this is the moment to go into the historical records, because we have especially two major items to speak about. The first one, something from the 15th century, the campaign of Thutmose III, in fact, establishing the Egyptian empire in Canaan, and then the Amarna tablets. So maybe we start with Thutmose. Tell me about him.
Sure. Thutmose III's story is the main story associated with Megiddo. You see it on all of the signs here. Not the main story, but one of the most important ones. And rightfully so. It's a really interesting story. Essentially, we have this amazing record written on the walls of the Temple of Amun at Karnak. Thutmose III celebrating his victory at Megiddo. And he was obviously very proud of it, because he inscribed a fairly detailed account of the campaign itself. And this is often something that's overlooked, a detailed account of everything that he brought back from this campaign. So let's get into the details here. The story starts with Thutmose III really anxious about the lands of Canaan rebelling against Egypt, which of course is an anachronism because the Egyptians didn't have control over this region at the time. But in any case, doesn't matter. This is his motivation.
It's legitimacy for conducting the campaign in a way.
That's right. Sure. Obviously, Thutmose is anxious about these Canaanite rulers causing problems, so he's assembling an army and he sets out on the road to solve the problem. It takes him a few days, but he comes on the northern coastal plain where the mountains of the Carmel start to head off into the sea, and he has to make a decision about which of many roads he will take across the mountain pass in order to attack Megiddo. He has this war council with his people, and in the council, they suggest that he go on one of these two safer roads, but he chooses the more dangerous central road, which is too narrow for his army to pass and defend itself. And it's a moment of bravado for him to show off, like, I can do the most dangerous thing, and I'm. So the army sets off through the pass. Indeed, they encounter resistance for the Canaanites as they're coming out of the pass into the valley near Megiddo. But don't worry, Thutmose himself fends off the entire Canaanite army so the rest of the Egyptian army can come through. Great, that's wonderful. Another battle ensues the following morning, just here in the plain outside of Megiddo, and the Egyptian troops rout the Canaanites, no problem, but they make one fatal mistake. They stop looting. They stop to loot the bodies of the Canaanites, and that gives the Canaanites a chance to get back into the city and lock the doors. Okay, so now Thutmose has
lock the doors.
Lock the doors. That's right. This gate right here. For the next several months, Thutmose III laid siege to Megiddo. He claims to have built a wall around the city, a moat around the city, and set up a little fortified camp for himself. Eventually, everyone inside gets really hungry, and they beg Thutmose to let them out. And he has two conditions. One, give me everything. And two, you have to swear allegiance to me. And this is where we get the famous line, the capture of Megiddo is the capture of 1,000 towns.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much exactly what happened. With his victory at Megiddo and the follow-up battles immediately thereafter, that established the Egyptian empire almost immediately.
We can imagine also that the battle was against a coalition of Canaanite kings, right, under the influence of foreign powers, right, and we can imagine that there were other kings who ran away from the battlefield in the moment of the looting and got into Megiddo. Yeah. So capturing Megiddo was really a decisive moment when the Egyptian empire is established in Canaan.
That's right.
The other important Egyptian record, in fact, or related to Egypt for Canaan is a bit later, because Thutmose is somewhere in the 15th century, not very late in the 15th century, and we are now turning to the middle of the 14th century. Basically, we don't know much historically about Canaan in the late Bronze Age, and here we are in the 14th century sitting in a theater, and all of a sudden, the screen opens and we see things, in detail, because we have this wonderful archive of almost 400 letters written in cuneiform script in Akkadian, sent by the petty kings of Canaan to Egypt or to the Egyptian administration, and some letters back to them, and also correspondence between the major powers of the time. And there is difference, of course, in the way that they correspond, because they address the big kings, they address each other as my brother, and the petty kings is a different story. They, always start with a big flattering to the pharaoh. So you can see also the way of addressing, the monarch, the big pharaoh. And Biridia, the king of Megiddo, is one of them. And from the correspondence, we can really understand much of what happened in Canaan at that time, which means the relationship between the Canaanite city-states, the relationship between the different demographic or social groups, better said perhaps, the town dwellers, the villages, and the nomadic groups, and also a group which can be described as outlaws acting on the periphery. The Apiru, yes, important also later in understanding, perhaps the one way or the other, but not in a direct way, the rise of ancient Israel. So all this we have in the correspondence, which is wonderful, really. And we can, in fact, even map Canaan of the late Bronze Age, establish quite an accurate map of the city-states. Megiddo was in some sort of a quarrel with neighboring petty kings, especially the one from the highlands, Labayu, the monarch of Shechem. So there is this struggle between the highlands and the Jezreel Valley, reminding us a little bit about things that happened a bit later in the, let's say, 11th, 10th centuries BC. 300 years later, the rise of ancient Israel and the rise of the Northern Kingdom, approximately along the same lines of conflict, which means that this is the classical situation of the long term, of the longue durée. The things continue because the geography is the same, so things continue also in later generations. We carried out at a time, because some of the places are difficult to identify because either the name is broken of the city or the name does not appear. So there was a little bit of dispute regarding the map, regarding the main city-states. And we carried out, in order to resolve this, we had an idea, my friends Nadav Naaman and Yuval Goren from Tel Aviv and me, to go to the letters themselves and take samples in order to identify the mineralogy. Which means the clay, exactly. Wow. If we identify the clay, we can really establish where this letter was sent from. And we checked the letters. We went into the museums in the world where the letters are kept, and we checked most of them. And I can tell you, and this is the good news, that the letters of the king of Megiddo, Biridia, were sent from Megiddo, and we were in fact able to identify the formation on the slope of the Tel, the place where the clay was taken from for the letter. So this shows you how modern archaeology, modern research works. So this is really interesting, and it gives us, I think that we can use this as a case study to understand Canaan of the late Bronze Age until the end of this period.
Let's turn now to the end of the Bronze Age, because of course this is a very vogue topic these days, and Megiddo has a lot to say about the end of the late Bronze Age.
Yes, so indeed we see, as I mentioned before, that the deterioration was gradual. But still, we need to give an answer. What happened exactly? What was the cause? What was the prime mover that brought about this collapse? Not only at Megiddo, the entire system of Canaan, the pull out of Egypt from Canaan, and the collapse around us in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in recent years, we have assembled researchers, our team, but also other teams working in the region, in the Middle East. We have assembled the information that really points to a major climate event at the end of the late Bronze Age. I think that we know together, especially from our own work in the Sea of Galilee, that we are speaking about a period of droughts and probably famine that started around the middle of the 13th century and became worse and worse and continued until around 1100. So a century and a half of a climate crisis, less precipitation. So, of course, in a place like Megiddo, this is not the end of the world because, the valley is fertile. And if you get 400 instead of 550 or 450 instead of 550 millimeters of rain per year, it's not the end of the world. However, the Levant is surrounded by steppe regions on the south and east, and some of the major towns are in the steppe regions, such as Damascus, for instance. And in Damascus, if you take from 300 down to 250, this can end in a catastrophe, in a calamity. So, and then because of this event, by the way, is supported by two other media. The first one, the destruction layers in Canaan, which are approximately in the same period of time between 1250 and 1100, and also in the records of the ancient Near East. We read about this crisis in letters from Ugarit along the Syrian coast, from Hatti in the north. There are indications from Egypt that there was this major crisis of food, supply of food, famine, hunger, and so on, between around 1250 and 1100. And because of this, people started moving and unrest, and the whole wonderful coyness, so to speak, the connection of the ancient Near East under the region, under Egyptian hegemony, the whole thing collapsed. And this was the beginning of the deterioration that brought about the final act in the late 12th century BC.
Great. Okay, so that ends the Bronze Age. I think next time we can get right into the Iron Age because something very different is about to happen. Hi.
Hi, Matt.
Last time we talked about the late Bronze Age. Today we're going to start our discussion of the Iron Age with the Iron I period, which is a very important period at Megiddo. In particular, last time we ended with the destruction or the slow pullout of Egypt and the slow destruction of Megiddo at the end of the late Bronze Age. But in many ways, the Iron I is something of a continuation of that. So I want to hit some of those themes as we're going on today. Give us the geographical background, because of course, we're in this period between the city-states of the late Bronze Age and looking forward toward the Iron II when we have these big territorial kingdoms. What does the geography say about how all of that gets moving?
So yes, exactly. I think that the most important feature that you mentioned is the fact that we are now shifting from the city-states of the Bronze Age to something very different of the Iron Age, which means the rise of the territorial kingdoms. And the beginning of the Iron Age is just in between, somewhere there. So let me first start with perhaps giving some background. In the beginning of the Iron Age, we archaeologists call this phase the Iron Age I. And it covers the Iron Age I, the period between, let's say, the late 12th century BC and the middle of the 10th century. So this is a period of about 2 centuries, the intermediate period between this world of Canaan, of the city-states of the late Bronze Age, and the ancient Israel with the rise of the territorial kingdoms, including Israel and Judah, of course, and the other kingdoms, the Arameans and Moab and Ammon and so on. So we have basically in the Iron I, the rise of these groups in the highlands, especially in the highlands. That is to say, the rise of ancient Israel, the first indications for this wave of settlement in the highlands, which brought about the rise of ancient Israel and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. This is in the highlands. Then in the southern coastal plain, or along the coast, we have the arrival of groups from the Aegean basin. Not very many people, but groups that took control over the city-states. Especially known among them are the Philistines, mentioned in the Bible, of course, and also these groups are mentioned in Egyptian records of the time of Ramesses III in the beginning of the 12th century BC. So we know quite a lot about them, perhaps less than we would have wished, but we know. And they settled along the coast with the Philistines in the south. And then the rest of the country, especially in the lowlands, there's some sort of continuity, we'll speak about it, of Canaanite life. Re-emergence or continuity, depends how you look at it. So these are the 3 parts of the country: Israelites, Judahites, Moabites, Ammonites, all these new nations rising, but of course from the local stock. I mean, we are not speaking about many people coming from outside. I mean, this is not what we are describing. We are speaking about the local population, but something happens that they become, I mean, these Canaanites in parts become Israelites, and these Canaanites in other areas become Moabites, if you wish, or Ammonites. There are new groups along the coast, but also local people, so which means there is no replacement of population, of course. They take control over these cities such as Ashkelon and Ekron and Gaza along the coast. And then the Canaanites, so to speak, the local population continues here. So this is the background. Now the dates, as I mentioned to you, between the 12th century and the 10th century BC.
Let's turn to Megiddo itself now.
Sure. So Megiddo itself, the situation is the following. We spoke about the collapse of Megiddo, the gradual deterioration, and then a crisis and destruction at the end of the late Bronze Age, in fact, into the beginning of the Iron One, the peak of this deterioration around 1100 BC.
Would you say that there is ever a true break?
There
is there an abandonment of the site?
No. There could have been a very short abandonment, but there's definitely not a break in the material culture, which means, we'll speak about it in a minute, the material culture continues or recovers the material culture of the second millennium, of Canaanite world of the second millennium. So, but the beginning of the recovery is slow and modest also. So we have some sort of a village here at Megiddo, I would say sometimes in the middle of the 11th century to the late 11th century, around 1050 BCE, perhaps a little bit before the recovery in the 11th century, but a small and modest village. And then this village develops into a major town, in fact, a very prosperous town. And we see this in every aspect of material culture. And this town probably, the beginning of this prosperity, of this emergence of a town out of a village, can be put somewhere in the late 11th century, close to 1000 BC. And thereby afterwards, after maybe 50 years of prosperity or so, destruction. And the destruction is very dramatic. We'll speak about it at the end. It is radiocarbon dated today, quite accurately around the first decades of the 10th century, but it's not the end of the Iron One. This is important to mention. It's a phase in the Iron One, in the late Iron One, not the end of this phase. The terminology Iron One comes from, again, ceramic typology, right. But we are not committed to historical processes here, right? So this is basically the situation. At the end, a prosperous city.
Tell us about the material culture of this very prosperous city. I want to know everything. Pottery, flint, everything.
I suppose that this is the most important point, which was not known to us before. If we speak about archaeology maybe 40, 30 years ago, this was not very clear. The material culture of this city, of the late Iron One, around 1000 BC, a little bit after, is a complete recovery of what we knew before in the late second millennium. So Canaanite culture, if you wish, of the late second millennium. To the point that if you give me a test and put here, two assemblages, let's say, of pottery from the end of the late Bronze Age and from the end of the Iron One, about 2 centuries apart, I suppose that I will not be able to distinguish between them very clearly and very easily. And this goes for the entire package of material culture. The layout of the city is basically the same, with the palace in the same place and the temple in the same place. The temple, the big temple of Canaanite Megiddo, continues until the beginning of the 10th century. The cult objects look alike. Metallurgy continues in the same way, in the same location. Flint industry continues. Jewelry is basically the same as we knew before. The architecture of the houses, what we see on the rim of the site, so to speak, in the southeastern sector, is basically the same with these courtyard houses. So every aspect of material culture is the same as it used to be before, or continuity of what was there before. And this is the reason that at a certain moment I gave it a title, New Canaan. Yeah. I think it's not such a good title, because I should have given it a different name, Renewed Canaan.
Renewed Canaan.
Renewed Canaan is perhaps better. So this is the interlude between the city-states and the early Israel and the Northern Kingdom here at Megiddo, but the interlude is closer to what used to be than to what is going to happen.
Wow, so this is a renewed Canaan without the Egyptian control now.
Exactly. This is perhaps exactly the description, the right description. Canaanite without Egyptian control, and the main revolution in the material culture is going to happen after the destruction of this city.
Let's talk more about the destruction, because it's very dramatic. In places, the destruction is 2 meters thick.
And everywhere. I mean, we, the two of us, are already trained, and we walk around the site, and we can point. We see the destruction, the red bricks, because of the big fire. By the way, the University of Chicago excavators gave it the title, the Red Brick City, because of this big destruction. The destruction is the mother of all destructions. I, in my career, have never seen something like this. I've never seen anywhere a big destruction, complete annihilation of the city.
What could destroy something like
exactly.
that? I mean,
So we have to understand this historically also. But first we need to say that, we archaeologists many times speak about destructions. Some of them are not exactly destructions. Some of them are light destructions, if I can say so, which means maybe partial destruction of a city.
Sure.
By the way, I think that when a big army comes, like the Assyrians, they are not, a big orderly army with the king, at the head of the army. They don't come with knives, between their teeth, to kill them all also. They have a plan. They know what they want to achieve. So sometimes they come and they take out part of the city. They destroy, they hit the ruling elite, but not the entire place, because, sometimes an army comes to stay. So why destroy a city if you can really exploit it later?
Sure. Not to mention the logistic challenge of destroying a city by hand is crazy.
Right, but this, the destruction of the late Iron One is something different. And by the way, not only at Megiddo, we see it in the entire valley. There are destructions at Bet Shean and in other places, Yokneam, which is not so far behind us here to the north, big destructions. But this one is really quite amazing. You described it correctly, collapse with fire and high temperature and vessels inside. This is a rich city. So, when we excavate it, we have beautiful finds, on the floors. It's really impressive. I mean, the tragedy of the past becomes impressive to us, archaeologists. And this is also the final act of Canaanite Megiddo, if you wish, of second millennium material culture, because what is going to emerge after a short gap in the 10th century, which means in the middle of the 10th century, something different is going to emerge, and there will be a revolution in material culture. All aspects that I spoke about 2-3 minutes ago will change completely over a period of several decades in the 10th century.
Wow. Do you find dead people in this destruction?
Yes, we do. We find here and there people who died perhaps after under the collapse, but more people who perhaps died and were interred in the city. And this is exceptional, because burials under floors of buildings are well known in the Middle Bronze Age into the beginning of the Late Bronze Age, but not in the Iron One. And the fact that they did it in the Iron One is perhaps an indication that there was some sort of a bitter end, siege, emergency at the end.
Wow. So I have to ask you the most important question. Who or what destroyed Megiddo?
This is a question, a straightforward question, but not very easy to answer. And we are struggling to answer this question. So first of all, we have to make a distinction between two possibilities or three possibilities. I mean, one could speak about an earthquake, a natural event. And there were voices in this direction in the past. I think that we do not have indication for this at Megiddo. I don't think that we can speak about a killer earthquake for a reason very simple, that we see that the destruction in the valley is not in the same moment. I'll be referring to it in a minute. Another possibility is a military campaign by a leader, by a general, so to speak, by a king. So in the early days of research, people were speaking, scholars were speaking about the Davidic conquest, Davidic wars, the phase of establishment of this mini empire of King David ruled from Jerusalem. We know that this is not acceptable for many reasons anymore, and we'll be speaking about it later in the series. So there is no great united monarchy. There is David, but there's no great empire with conquest from Jerusalem in the 10th century. Then there were voices, including me for a while, considering the possibility of destruction by a pharaoh, Sheshonq I, the founder of the 22nd dynasty in Egypt. We know about him and about the campaign, first of all, from Egypt. We know about him also from the Bible under the title Shishak in the probably second half of the 10th century BC. But what stands against this, also against the earthquake theory, but also at the same time against one major campaign with destruction, is the evidence from radiocarbon. Because we do have now, we assembled evidence from several sites in the region, Megiddo, Yokneam, and other places, and we see in the western part of the valley and the eastern part of the valley, of the Jezreel Valley. And we see that these destructions did not come in the same moment. There is standard deviation, so to speak, difference between the destructions, which is too big to assume that we are dealing with the same event. Okay. So there were destructions in the valley along the 10th century. So we are dealing with the process rather than with an event. And then if it's a process, this limits very much the possibilities of understanding it. And I think that we are sort of channeled into one solution that I would call it the takeover of the valley by the Highlanders, which means Highlanders, I refer to the early Israelites, again coming from the same stock of people, but organized socially and politically or geopolitically, if you wish, in a different way. And they start expanding from the highlands and they take over cities in the lowlands. And in fact, what we are watching, what we are seeing here, what we are referring to is the process which ultimately led to the rise of the northern kingdom of Israel and the control of the northern kingdom here and the making of Megiddo into a major administrative center of the northern kingdom.
Does anything from the biblical texts allude to this, give us any clues to this, explain this?
Yes, yes. So this is a big question. And I suppose that very cautiously, I would say that perhaps the answer is in a way positive. You see, I'm cautious here. And I'll tell you why, because we are speaking about a big difference chronologically. There is no writing in ancient Israel of biblical texts, in my opinion at least, until 800 BC or so in the northern kingdom, and even later in Judah into the 7th century BC. So even if we are speaking about the early 8th century and early 8th century composition of a biblical text, we are still about a century and a half away or 2 centuries away from the events, and the question would be, how do they know, how do they remember? But still, I think that there is some sort of an echo which can be followed in two biblical records, I think, which can be traced perhaps in two biblical records. The first is in the first half of the book of Judges, in the Savior stories in Judges. These stories come from the northern kingdom. They were apparently put in writing for the first time sometimes in the 8th century, perhaps in the beginning of the 8th century, under the days, in the days of Jeroboam II, but they reflect back. And they reflect back on events that can be put on the reality of the days before the rise of the northern kingdom, I suppose, or in the early days. So we are in the 10th century BC. And there is one very good example in the valley. I refer here to chapters 4 and 5 in the book of Judges, telling us about confrontations in the valley. Chapter 4 is the prose, chapter 5 is the Song of Deborah, the very well-known Song of Deborah. Scholars usually refer to these memories as reflecting on basically one event in the very early days. I suppose that we are dealing with two events, but in any way, Megiddo is mentioned in the Song of Deborah, together with Ta'anak, a little bit to the south of us. So there may be in the stories in chapters, in the story in chapter 4 and the song in chapter 5, an echo for unrest in the valley in the 10th century BC, perhaps with a question mark. Yeah. Another piece of information may come from the story in the stories, in the book of Samuel, about the days of King Saul, and the fact that King Saul was involved all the way north to the Gilboa, Mount Gilboa, which is not so far from us, overlooking the valley, which means that the kingdom of Saul, well, the territorial entity ruled by perhaps an historical figure called Saul, which is an early Israelite, if you wish, territorial entity, sometime around the late 11th century, around 1000 BC, managed to spread all the way north to the margin of the Jezreel Valley, and the involvement here of Saul with Mount Gilboa is possibly another indication for the unrest in the valley in the beginning of the 10th century BC.
Great, so we can see with these destructions in the valley and this terrible destruction here at Megiddo, the end of an era, right? The end of the late Bronze Age proper, this Canaanite late Bronze Age, and the arrival of Israelites on the scene, which we can talk about next time. Well, here we are again, back at Megiddo. Last time we were talking about the Iron Age I at Megiddo, this amazing city that was destroyed in this horrific fire in the early 10th century. Now we're going to go on to the next periods, the Iron Age II. Can you give us a little bit of introduction to that period?
We are going to speak today about the early years of the northern kingdom of Israel, after the destruction indeed of this city in the beginning of the 10th century. The first question is what exactly happened after the destruction, also the nature of the destruction. So a reminder, we spoke about it in the clip before, that this is a very meaningful watershed, so to speak, point in the history of Megiddo, the final act of Canaanite Megiddo, if you wish to call it that way, of the material culture tradition of the second millennium BC, ending in a big destruction. Then apparently, in part at least, I would say the middle of the 10th century BC, I suppose that we see some sort of a gap, and then there is recovery. And the recovery is very different from what we knew before, because we see new strands of material culture in every aspect, the layout of the city, the architecture, the pottery, other finds. It's a new thing altogether. No less important, this new thing, that new assemblage of material culture, then continues all the way down to the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel in 732 by the Assyrians. So we are speaking about 200 years of developing material culture, but of the same sort, the same kind. And this is and part of it, I mean, we should, I think, divide it into two phases. Okay. And today we'll speak about the first phase, which means the early years. Now, archaeologically speaking, we are now able, thanks to the very good stratigraphy here at Megiddo and our radiocarbon program, we are now able to divide the first half, which we call Iron IIA. This is the terminology. The period of time between, let's say, 950 and 800 BC, perhaps a little bit later, 780, 790, somewhere there. We're speaking about 150 years, which we are able now to divide into 4 phases. Wow. And I suggest that today we'll speak about the 2 first phases. So we will cover in this clip today the period of time between 950 and around 840 BC. So about a century, the first century in the history of the northern kingdom of Israel.
If you had to put this, these absolute dates in terms of biblical kings that we might recognize, who would they be?
Exactly. So in terms of biblical history, the book of Kings, first and foremost, the story of the 2 Hebrew kingdoms living side by side, we are dealing here with the first kings of the northern kingdom. And, you know, many of them, the 6 first kings, 4 of them ruled for a very short period of time. There were uprisings and all sorts of riots among the Israelites of that time. But there were 2 important kings. I will say a few words about them maybe later. Jeroboam first, the founder, with a question mark whether he is historical or not. Some say not. I would say perhaps yes. and Baasha, because they also ruled for a longer period of time, and perhaps we can say something about them when combining the archaeological record with the biblical record. And then after the six first kings, we come to the great Omride dynasty. So much of what we are going to describe today in this clip is this great dynasty, the first prosperity of Israel, the northern kingdom, mini empire stretching over big parts of the Levant in the first half of the 9th century, starting with Omri, the first king, continuing with the Ahab, the very famous, well-known king, and ending with Joram, who was the last king of the Omride dynasty, and the demise of the Omride dynasty as a result of the Battle of Ramoth Gilead with Damascus in Transjordan, and the uprising within the military of the army of the Northern Kingdom, according to the Book of Kings.
You spoke about these early kings. Can we detect this slow rise or recovery here in the archaeology of Megiddo?
Sure. So first of all, we know very well how to detect the Omrides, because we have this monumental architecture, and this is very well radiocarbon dated. So we know that we are in the period of the Omrides, that is to say in the first half of the 9th century. So then if we go a little bit back, also in the stratigraphy, we can identify the first year, the first 50 years or so of the Northern Kingdom. And what we see is very interesting. We see the early beginnings. They are kind of modest. Perhaps we see some sort of Egyptian influence here, because there is the very well-known block carrying the name of Sheshonq I, the founder of the 22nd dynasty in Egypt. This is biblical Shishak mentioned in the Book of Kings. And there is reason to argue that perhaps he was involved one way or the other with the arrangements here around the middle of the 10th century, the arrangements which brought about in the expansion of the highlanders into the Northern Valley, meaning the emergence of the Northern Kingdom. So we see this is a very important item here that we need to remember. It is on display today in the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, the building block of Sheshonq the first, biblical Shishak. So and then there is this biblical tradition that Jeroboam first went to Shishak to Egypt, ran away, then came back. So in my opinion, at least, there is some sort of a memory there, which may perhaps explain the involvement of Egypt in what happened in Canaan in the middle of with the rise of the 22nd dynasty, and attempts of Egypt to bring back the great moment of control over Canaan. Let's put it this way. So we see this also at Megiddo. And then there's a small village, and it starts developing. And in fact, we see the very beginning, but we see also another phase, which is important, and we managed to identify it only recently, because we are in such good control over radiocarbon and the stratigraphy and all the rest. We identify a middle phase between the very beginning, probably connected to this Sheshonq first affair and involvement here in Canaan, and the Omrides. And Asaf Kleiman and me, my student Asaf Kleiman and me, we published an article under the nice title, The Archaeology of the Days of Baasha, with a question mark. Why is that? Because Baasha, according to the biblical chronology, falls there around 900 BC. And we have the radiocarbon dates, and the radiocarbon dates put us around 900 BC. Okay. So we are in the days of Baasha, if you wish. He was the most significant king, and there is good reason about him for sure to say that he's historical. There are hints about it, and he probably also tried to begin the expansion and the creation of the Northern Kingdom. After all, what is the Northern Kingdom? The Northern Kingdom is a change from the city-states of the beginning of the Iron Age to the territorial kingdoms of the later phases of the Iron Age. And the meaning is that in the context of the valley here, that the people from the highlands, the city-state from the highlands, call it Shechem, for that matter, expands into the valley, takes over other city-states and establishes, this a bigger than city-state entity, territorial entity, and we call it a state, a kingdom, and this is the Northern Kingdom. So we see Baasha apparently here in the valley, and I think that about his phase we should raise two interesting points. The first one, we see the very beginning, the appearance for the first time in this context of monumental architecture. There's this temple, apparently, which we excavated on the other side of the site.
Right.
We are sitting here near the gates. In the background, the gates, we'll be speaking about them. So a temple, continuing the tradition of a central temple at Megiddo, which comes from the second millennium, but not in the same place, right, and not in the same layout. So it's something different, but still sort of a reminder, a vague reminder, and it is significant. After the central temple disappears, we'll be speaking about it. So this is one item that we need to remember, because before there is no sign of monumentality whatsoever. And the second thing is that we get the first appearance of Cypriot pottery. So the first contacts with the regions in the Mediterranean to our west, in the around 900, the very beginning of the 9th century, sorry. And here, as usual, we spoke about it in the first clip, if you remember, about the importance of Megiddo. This is highly important, not only for Megiddo to say that they were already strong enough and prospering enough in order to have these contacts and imports from Cyprus. This is important for Cyprus because we can now, according to the Megiddo system, provide Cyprus with the
Right.
beginning date. We said that they need to line up, you remember?
I do, yeah.
So we give the scholars working in Cyprus, we give them a peg for the appearance of this type of pottery in Cyprus as well. So this is important beyond the boundaries of Megiddo. This, I think, is what I can say about the early phase before the Omrides arrive.
Wow, so the early phase of the Iron II is really kind of a slow development. It starts as a village, then we start to see an increase in monumental activity and connections to the outside world. And then we get to the Omrides, right?
Yeah.
What does that change like?
So this is really a revolution in the sense of a boom at Megiddo. It becomes a very important place. This is a major administration center of the Northern Kingdom with monumental architecture. In fact, quite a monumental city in the first half of the 9th century BC. And we see this all over, everywhere. So I think that we should start by mentioning some of the monuments. I mean, that usually people who watch us, they know about these monuments because they are into, the archaeology of the land of Israel. So a little bit to the east of us, there are the remains of the palace, which was excavated first by Yigal Eliadin and then by us, known by the title Palace 6000. I mean, the number is meaningless, but just to remember, this is the northern palace of Megiddo, or northeastern. A very beautiful monument, big one, built of ashlar masonry. The blocks are very beautifully cut. So it is a very elaborate building. I mean, not only at Megiddo, but even judging beyond the boundaries of the state of Israel, the borders of the state of Israel. And a similar palace was excavated in the southern part of the mound and removed by the University of Chicago team, except for some blocks that I will refer to in a few minutes. So we have two major palaces, beautifully built in this site. They are the center of administration for the kingdom. And then there is a very beautiful gate. And we are sitting here and we are looking at the gate behind us. In fact, the camera, I think, sees more than one gate. So we need to refer to the lower gate, the chamber which is here below me, below us, and the chambers on the side. Down here, this is the famous six-chambered gate of Megiddo, known as the Solomonic Gate of Megiddo in the history of research. And there is a lot to say about this. You know, we are now a step ahead already, and we are not speaking anymore of Megiddo of the days of Solomon, of King Solomon. I cite here an article by Yigal Eliadin from the 1960s, Megiddo of the Kings of Israel, and especially Solomon, Solomonic Megiddo. You know that scholars were always looking for Solomon at Megiddo because of the verse in the book of Kings, 1 Kings 9:15. However, the question is how to read this verse. Of course, 1 Kings 9:15 mentions the construction by Solomon of Megiddo and Hatzor and Gezer. And I think most of our viewers probably know that Yadin came here after excavating at Hatzor, and he said, well, look at the gates, they are similar. So there was this architect sending blueprints from Jerusalem, same similar gates and so on. A neat idea, when I came to study archaeology, this was the thing, and we were all really excited about it, that we finally caught,
Solomon.
Solomon. We know where Solomon is in the stratigraphy of Megiddo. It was very appealing, this theory. However, it was wrong. One of the first moments that I suspected that something is wrong here is connected to the Southern Palace over there. Because when they dismantled the Southern Palace, the University of Chicago, and they took the blocks away and put them there in the southeastern sector of the tell, they in fact gave us the possibility to look very carefully at the blocks. And the blocks have mason's marks. Okay. Chicago saw this, and they even drew the mason's marks. Now, these mason's marks are very unique. They appear only in one more building in the entire country, okay, in context I'm speaking. Yeah. And this is the palace of the kings of Israel at Samaria. And we are here in a very awkward situation because the palace of the kings of Israel is at Samaria, 9th century, and here we are in the 10th century. So what's going on? We have either to pull one or to push another. Right. And there are good reasons to say that it is impossible, to update Samaria. So we have to downdate Megiddo. This was the first indication, and there were many more indications vis-a-vis the pottery between Megiddo and Jezreel, which is not far from here. By the way, also vis-a-vis the gate behind us, it was quite clear from the stratigraphy around the gate that there is a problem here, one way or the other. In fact, there were clues even before radiocarbon that the two palaces need to be dated to the time of the Omride dynasty. This gate is a different story. We'll refer to it in a few minutes, I suppose, but about the palaces. And indeed, later, when we started this program of radiocarbon dating here at Megiddo, and also drawing from other sites, and we can make the comparison according to the pottery horizon. So we know where we are in this phase of the Omrides, which we call late Iron IIA. We know exactly how it looks from the pottery perspective, and then the accompanying radiocarbon. So we know today that the two palaces are in the 9th century, in the first half of the 9th century. So we are in the time of this great dynasty of the Omrides, and we strip, so to speak, Megiddo from Solomon, or strip Solomon from Megiddo. So what about Solomonic Megiddo? This has to do with the way that we read the text, and I think, have the legitimacy to ask the question whether the author of the Book of Kings, when speaking about Hatzor and Megiddo and Gezer, in fact knows something about Megiddo closer to his own time, that these were the famous administrative centers of the Northern Kingdom, and he telescopes this into the time of King Solomon, right, to fulfill his ideology of late monarchic Judah when Israel is no more. So it's a little bit complex what I said now, but this is the way, right, we need to understand this.
I suppose it's quite logical to put these monumental structures into the period of the Omrides for other reasons. I mean, this is when the Omrides are the first of the Israelites that really appear on the international scene.
Right. You are absolutely right, Matt, and thank you for reminding me to put this in context. It's really important because, the Omrides, we know about them. They really played big time on the international scene. No more, a small entity in the highlands, away from the main international roads, away from the main events. So they are mentioned in several inscriptions of the time. The king of Moab says to us in the Mesha Stele that the Omrides took parts of Moab from his father, from his ancestors in the before him and that he takes back this territory. The king of Damascus writes this Tel Dan inscription also in the 9th century, second half of the 9th century. And from his text, it is clear that the Omrides probably expanded in the direction of Damascus, and this is the reason for him, or the legitimacy for him to take territory back. And then, of course, we have Shalmaneser III describing this amazing story about the Battle of Karkar, 400 kilometers away from us to the north. King Ahab is mentioned by name as Ahab the Israelite. This is the first time that we have Israel in extra biblical text after 350 years, since Merneptah, in around 1200 BC. And he says that Ahab came to the battle with 2,000 chariots, huge army. He is the most powerful militarily entity, coming to the Battle of Karkar. And in fact, when you look at the outcome of this world war of the ancient world, at Karkar in 853 BC, Assyria on one side, the coalition with Ahab on the other side. In fact, Assyria was stopped for a while. So it's really interesting. So we have these indications for the greatness of the Omrides, military, territorially. And here we have at Megiddo, the palaces and the gate. I'll be speaking about the gate in a minute. And the gate indicating, not only the greatness from the point of view of the geopolitics, but also from the perspective of material culture.
So I see in the monuments that you've already described, this big monumental ashlar masonry is a very distinctive feature of this phase. Can you tell us some more about other distinct features of this period?
So first of all, about monumentality and architecture, I need to say a word or two, because we are sitting here near the gate, and the gate is below us. This is the Solomonic gate, which is in fact Omride gate. I cannot, sign to you that it's Ahab and not Joram or something like that, one of the kings of the Omride dynasty. I suppose Ahab was the strongest of them all, so perhaps he ruled between approximately 870 and 850 BC. Now, the gate is interesting because it was a bone of contention in archaeological discussion. And we carried out, as you remember, the two of us and others, we carried out rescue excavations here before the reconstruction of the other part of the gate by the Parks Authority last year or 2 years ago. And we were able to confirm that the gate was indeed built in the first half of the 9th century in the days of the Omride dynasty. I would just say now, just for the sake of the camera, that we see also several elements above this gate, and these elements belong to later gates, and we will be speaking about them in one of our or two of our later clips. So this is also very monumental. By the way, pay attention to something interesting, which would, I suppose it will sound very peculiar or strange to our viewers, but it is not the only place. The gate here is not connected to a city wall. So it is a ceremonial gate. It is a manifestation of the greatness of the monarch. It is a show-off, it is a prestige item in a way. Later in the history of Megiddo, the gate will be connected with the fortification starting a bit later.
Let's talk about some of the other finds that we can date to this period.
So we see several processes. I mean, we tell the story here in a very brief way, but let me, I think, pick up two items which I wish to mention. The first one is about cult. Cult is always interesting. And we can follow the cult of Megiddo for many centuries, I mean, the two of us, you were there really with the hands in the dirt, excavating the early bronze temples. We spoke about them in one of our previous clips. So the temples of the early Bronze Age, starting before 3000 BC.
Sure.
And then the big temple of the second millennium, which we referred to when we spoke about the Middle Bronze Age. Right. And then it continued into the Late Bronze Age. And then it continued into that temple, a new temple, not in the same location from the days of Baasha, if you wish, right. around 900 BC or so. And then something happens. There is a change. When the Omrides come, this is a strong dynasty. Please remember the meaning of a temple like this. The meaning of a temple like this is that the priesthood controls the economy.
Okay.
So who wants to control here? The king or the priest? So there is a clash between the local powers and the dynasty, and the Omrides put some order into this chaotic situation. They abolished the central shrine. No more central shrine at Megiddo. There is cult at Megiddo, but the cult is put in an administrative building. So what do they tell to the locals? They tell them, you wanna have cult? Okay, fine, fair enough. But you practice your cult where we tell you to do this in our administration center, under our control, under our economic control. This is a big change. And this change continues also later until the destruction of the Northern Kingdom. No more central big cult temple, but a cult room, so to speak, in one of the administrative centers. So far, my dear Matt, good news. Now the bad news.
Uh-oh.
There are 2 points which annoy me at least, and I suppose others as well, when we speak about Omride Megiddo, of the Omride dynasty of the time of Ahab, those kings. The first annoyance is the following. I have just described to you, and I mean, you know it very well, but to the viewers, the story of Shalmaneser III, telling us about the Battle of Karkar, describing Ahab coming with a huge force of chariots, so many horses, hundreds of horses, march 400 kilometers from us to the north. They must be well trained. You have to put 2 horses, in a chariot. You must train them properly. We have the stables for the 8th century BC. Where are the stables of the 9th century? No stables at Megiddo for now. So we started saying, well, perhaps the stables were at Jezreel. No stables at Jezreel. Right. So we started saying, well, perhaps at Jezreel the stables are in the part of the site which is overbuilt by medieval village. A very convenient way to explain things, that we cannot find. However, I think that today, the 2 of us, we have maybe a clue here for Ahab's stables at Megiddo. Why am I looking for them at Megiddo? Because this is the place of the famous stables of the 8th century, of the period of, let's say, the King Jeroboam II in the first half of the 8th century BC. So why not look at Megiddo? We have one place to give us some sort of an indication for possible stables earlier than the first half of the 8th century, and there is a place where we can look for them because all the central part of the site is completely covered by remains of a later period, the Assyrian period, of the 7th century BC. And perhaps under these buildings, a surprise is waiting for us. Who knows? The other point, some sort of an annoyance, is about writing.
Okay.
We are describing this great mini empire of the Omrides, and they go from here with horses to the Battle of Karkar, and they construct monumental buildings. For both endeavors, you need administration, and you need people to write and say, well, we are sending 2 horses from here to here. We are sending the masons from the village of this to the village of that, and so on. No writing. And we, in fact, in the territory of the Northern Kingdom, in the agreed upon territory of the Northern Kingdom, in the time of the Omride dynasty, I think that we have one inscription of a letter and a half from Megiddo here. So this is very strange. I mean, there are inscriptions at Rehov, a little bit to the west of us. According to Amichai Mazar, Rehov of the period, of the first half of the 9th century, is an Israelite city. I think that perhaps it is under some sort of Aramean influence or Aramean culture, so we are discussing this, but anyway, the problem is here. And most scholars dismiss this problem or explain it by saying that perhaps at that time all writing or most writing was on papyri, and papyri, of course, do not preserve. In my opinion, I'm always getting very nervous when I get this explanation, because there are several media of writing. If there is papyri, I suppose that I have to see other media of writing, like Ostraka, like Boule, like monumental, seal impressions. So this is one of the great enigmas still left in order to explain, the northern kingdom of Israel in the time of the Omride dynasty.
So let's wrap up the discussion of the Omride dynasty and move on to the next one, the next clip, by describing how does Megiddo transition from Omride to the next great thing?
Yes, so we have a small destruction, not a total destruction. In archaeology, we speak about destructions very frequently. Not all of them are big destructions. In the history of Megiddo, there are some bigger destructions, but there is some sort of disturbance, and not a small one. At the end of this phase, of the Omride phase, which means the late Iron IIA at Megiddo, radiocarbon dated around the middle or a little bit later than the middle of the 9th century, probably associated with what we know from extra biblical texts as well as from the Bible of the confrontation between Israel and Damascus in 840, 841 in the Battle of Ramoth Gilead. The northern kingdom and Damascus, they were the two entities which competed on the hegemony of the Levant at that time, and the upper hand was with the Omrides for a while, and then now Damascus. Israel was defeated in the Battle of Ramoth Gilead, and we have indications for conquest of many places by Hazael and destructions. Hazael was the king of Damascus, so Damascus took over the valley for a while, and we have these 40 years between 840 and 800 BC, hegemony of Damascus. When we compare the material culture of Megiddo to the material culture of, say, a site like Hatzor, farther to the northeast from us, we see that the phase is missing here at Megiddo. This is what we call terminal Iron IIA, the last decades of the Iron IIA. So apparently there was some sort of a hiatus, of an occupational gap here at Megiddo after the demise of the Omride kingdom. Not only the demise of the kingdom, also the demise of the dynasty. And then later, Megiddo recovers.
Okay, let's talk about that one next time. Last time we were talking about the city of the Omride dynasty and some difficulty that the Omrides began to have with the entity of Damascus. And you suggested that there was some sort of disturbance here at Megiddo around 840 or so, maybe a partial destruction. Let's pick up with that and take us into the next period, the Iron IIb.
Sure. So I think that we can notice in the material culture some sort of evidence for a gap of occupation at Megiddo after around 840. Again, remember that we are still well radiocarbon dated there.
Right.
So there is several decades of abandonment, I suppose, or a very low-level activity. And how do we do this? We do this by comparing what we see here at Megiddo to sites around us, such as Hatzor, farther in the north. And then there's this recovery at Megiddo, and it's already the material culture which goes with the recovery, is already that of the Iron IIb, what we describe as the Iron IIb. The transition from the Iron IIa to the Iron IIb, according to our radiocarbon studies, should be located somewhere around 800 BC, perhaps 10 years later, 1520. Of course, the transition is always gradual because we are speaking about pottery traditions, so we need to keep this in mind. And then there's this recovery, and we get really the second big prosperity of the Northern Kingdom as represented here at Megiddo. And basically, we are speaking at the later phase of the Northern Kingdom, so I suppose looking at the geopolitical situation in the region, that we start with Joash of the Nimshite dynasty. The Nimshites started with Jehu, but in the beginning they were completely under the power of Damascus. Joash was the first one who managed to fight back and win a battle against Damascus and recover the power of the Northern Kingdom also in the lowlands, because the Northern Kingdom survived in the highlands around Samaria. But now they take over again their lands in the lowlands, including the Jezreel Valley. So this is Joash, and this happens around 800 BC. And the kings that we need to pay attention to are Joash and his son Jeroboam II, our beloved king. The two of us, were dealing with this king both here and at Kiryat Yearim near Jerusalem several years ago. So Jeroboam II, he was first of all he is the king who ruled for more than 4 decades. So we are speaking grosso modo about I'm not giving the exact dates here, grosso modo 780 to 740 BC, a little bit more than 40 years. And we know from different pieces of evidence that he was a powerful king. He managed to expand. We have this even in the prophetic works in the Bible. He expanded in the northeast, in the north, and he really established a mini empire. Now Israel has the upper hand when we compare it to Damascus. So there is half a century of a very strong power of the northern kingdom, more than half a century, perhaps 60 years of very strong dominance of the northern kingdom until it starts crumbling for different reasons, but especially under the power of Assyria, the change of power in Assyria and different policy of conquering these lands in the west. So Jeroboam II. So when we speak about the Iron IIb at Megiddo, we refer mainly to a layer which had been, big parts of it had been uncovered by the University of Chicago in the 20s, in fact. And then also we deal with this layer in several places at the site.
This is a very special city in this particular period. It's given over to a completely new plan with some very particular buildings that sort of dominate 1/3 of the layout of the city. Can you tell us about those buildings?
We are sitting in one of them.
Okay.
So we are sitting in one of them. This is a city with 17 buildings of this type, 17 structures, and they are big. I mean, they are like 30 meters long and maybe more than 10 meters broad. And they are very specific. Each of these buildings has 3 aisles. The central aisle is paved with plaster, and the 2 side aisles with stones, paving. And then in between there are rows of pillars, stone pillars, and troughs. This is one of the troughs. This is another trough over here. And because of this very special structure, they were described immediately, when they were found, as stables. And the University of Chicago, in the beginning, one of the excavators, PLO guy, came up with this idea that these are the stables of Solomon. Now, why is Solomon? There is no indication in the Bible that Solomon built stables at Megiddo. However, there is indication in the Bible that Solomon built Megiddo in 1 King 9:15. And then in the book of Kings, in those chapters which speak about him as a great ruler, the stories of construction and trade and wisdom and all this, several times horses and chariots and stalls pop up. So Solomon is the king of the stables and horses in these chapters in the beginning of the book of Kings. And at that time, in the 1920s, a little bit naive in the way that we are looking, some of us, at the Bible, they came up with this idea that here are the Solomonic stables of Megiddo. The problem was that a bit later, these buildings became, some sort of a center of dispute on 2 accounts. The first one is the date, how to date them, and the second one, the function. Are they really stables?
Right. Let's talk about the date first. So the original excavators called them Solomonic. A little bit later, they called the next layer down Solomonic. And then, of course, our team comes here and does some renewed work here. How do we date these stables, and on the basis of what? How do we tie this into our chronology?
So today the situation is quite clear because we know well the stratigraphy of the site, and we know what's below and what's above. So the stables, the buildings, let's call them for the time being the buildings, these structures, the pillared buildings of Megiddo. And again, there are 17 of them, and the big courtyards, in front of them. So they are sandwiched between the Assyrian city on top, and the 9th century city that we spoke about it before, below them. And they are tied to the fortification which encircles the Megiddo. And also according to the pottery found not in them, because they had already been cleared by the University of Chicago, structures which are related to them, to this layer, there's no question that we are in the 8th century. We need to say to the viewers that in the 8th century, we are in a problem that we cannot use radiocarbon because of problems of the calibration. Let's put it this way. Perhaps we can in the very beginning of the 8th century, but not later. So radiocarbon doesn't play a role. But however, we know very well where we are, and we also see at the end of this phase, of this layer at Megiddo, of this stratum at Megiddo, the stratum of the stables, we see evidence of destruction, and this is for sure destruction inflicted on Megiddo, partial destruction, inflicted on Megiddo by Tiglath-Pileser III, the great king of Assyria, in 732 BC.
Let's talk about the function. I know that there's been a lot of dispute about this. Stables, of course, originally proposed, and then lots of ideas: textile dyeing, opium processing, all sorts of
barracks,
right?
Storehouses, yes.
I think it's worth saying that this type of building has been excavated all over the southern Levant, and every time it's been excavated, as far as I can see, it seems to have had a different function. Without the troughs here at Beersheba, there were storehouses. At Mudanya, there were textile processing. This is a generic style of building.
Yeah.
How do we know what it's used for here?
So first of all, I must give you a reflection on my early days in archaeology.
Okay.
I still remember, there was this dispute between Yadin, Yigael Yadin, the Israeli archaeologist. He was in favor of the stables and speaking about the Megiddo stables in line with the University of Chicago. And Yochanan Haroni, my teacher at Tel Aviv University, excavated Beersheba. You mentioned it. And at Beersheba, there's no question that at least in the last phase, they served as storage places, storehouses, because they were full of vessels, pottery vessels. There is a saying in Hebrew that it has two meanings, and he said something with a smile. I still remember, even on television, these were the early days of television in Israel, mocking the whole thing that they are not stables anymore. That's it. But this is not so simple when we look at Megiddo. First of all, the Beersheba structures, they look the same, but there are only a few of them. There is no place in the entire Levant. There is no place, as far as I know, in the entire region, even beyond, the borders of the state of Israel and the neighboring countries, with a city devoted to these buildings. I mean, we are sitting here at Megiddo, a big city with the palaces of the layer before, and all of a sudden there's this change, and the whole thing becomes, the pillared buildings. And it was a little bit difficult for many to digest the idea that, one of the best real estates in the land of Israel is given to horses. So it's you need to understand what's going on here. Right. In any event, there were all sorts of ideas. And when we started here, we decided to attack, first of all, this issue by introducing methods from the exact sciences or life sciences. And there is a way perhaps to do it, learning from other places in the region where there were attempts to identify remains of horses, in the sediments, of course. Right. And but here at Megiddo it didn't work because there were no controls. In science you always need controls, and here everything was contaminated with animals, with evidence for animals. So it didn't work. We did our best, it didn't work, and then we were kind of desperate, I would say, semi-desperate. And we decided to take a completely different direction. And we brought here scholars from the United States who were at the same time also raising horses, especially Deborah Cantrell, who worked here with us for several years, and then later she wrote a book, The Horsemen of Israel, and I strongly recommend it. And Deborah was really an expert. She studied Bible at that time at Vanderbilt, in the States, and she had stalls in Tennessee. So she raised horses, and she knew horses very intimately. The raising, the breeding, the training, everything. And here we were sitting here in this place with a big tent and having conferences in the mornings, like now, discussing the question, and we were raising questions. For instance, how is it that there are no... She came immediately in the beginning, and she said, these are stables, forget it. I mean, you only come to my stalls in Tennessee, and I will show it to you. And I did go later. So we said to Deborah Cantrell, how is it, for instance, that there are no horse bones? How is it that we don't find horse teeth? How did they clean the facility? How did they shade it? How could they put, horses here standing in line and take one horse and go all over behind, with all the horses standing quietly and not kicking, the horse passing behind them. So I'm not going to go into details. She was able really quietly to answer all the questions from her very strong experience, and detailed experience in her stalls in Tennessee, in the United States. And she convinced us, of course, not to mention that there are other pieces of evidence, extra-biblical, also from archaeology. Bastam, far away in the northeastern sector of the ancient Near East, where a building like this indeed produced evidence for horses in the sediments. So basically, we closed this issue very well. I mean, the fact that we are dealing with horses.
Okay, let's say we're convinced about the horses, as you say. It's still, this is one of the most important cities before and after. Why devote so much of it to horses?
I think that the answer should come from the economy. So it's first of all, it's all about the economy, right? We remember one campaign of elections in the United States.
Economy, stupid.
Exactly. It's all about the economy. So here also it's all about the economy. Today we think about horses. Okay, what do we care about horses? I'm telling you now, summarizing now for you what we wrote, Deborah and me, in one big chapter in one of the Megiddo reports, looking at the evidence of the entire region, ancient Near East at that time. We are speaking in the 9th and 8th centuries BC about the big period of the most important period of chariotry, of chariot warfare. Okay. And here's the trick. There are horses. I'm not a horse person. I'm now citing what I was taught by Deborah and others. There are horses in the south, in Nubia and Egypt, and there are horses in the north, in the steppe regions in the far north. Right. And they are not the same. The northern horses are smaller, the southern horses are bigger. And for the chariots, you need the southern horses. Because if you put to the battlefield two chariots, one with northern horses and the other one with southern horses, it's not a match. So we are speaking about a period when Assyria did not control directly, neither here nor farther to the south in Egypt. So they needed somebody to provide them with the horses. Okay. And Israel took advantage of this situation, very specific geopolitical situation in the first half of the 8th century, to become the go-between, which means to import big horses from Egypt. And they bred them here, and they trained them here, and they then sold them. So we know there are vague pieces of evidence, but still evidence for this. For instance, let me give you one example. We have evidence from an inscription of Sargon II. This is the king who takes Samaria. So he is in around 720 BC, and later. And he speaks about incorporation of a chariot unit of the army of Israel, if you wish, with its commander into the Assyrian military, into the Assyrian army. And there is even perhaps a more tricky piece of evidence, and I'm going back now to Solomon and the horses in the Book of Kings, because one can ask whether all this is not retrospected or telescoped back by the author. I believe that all this description of Solomon in Kings, in 1 Kings between chapter 3 and chapter 10, reflects realities of Israel in the 8th century and Judah in the beginning of the 7th century. And the author assembled the memories and the information and portrays this great Solomon in order to promote his ideology of competing with the memory of the great northern kingdom, which is no more at that time, and to also compete with within Judah, the big debate, of where to go. He comes from the Deuteronomistic camp, and he is opposing to others and so on. In any event, all this information, I think the Solomon as a raising horses, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer built by Solomon, the visit of the Queen of Sheba, the expeditions to Etzion Geber and Arabia and the south and so on. All this, in my opinion, comes from realities of the 8th century and then again in the beginning of the 7th century. So these realities, what the author of the Book of Kings has in mind, the memory of Megiddo, the great horse industry city. The horse industry was one of the main economic ventures of the Northern Kingdom. If we think about the Northern Kingdom in the 8th century BC, we think about what? We think about oil, perhaps. We think about having this port at door. We may think about Arabian trade, according to some evidence in the south. And we can definitely speak about the horse industry, bringing from the south, training them here, and selling them to whoever pays more.
All right, so roughly 1/3 of the city is stables. What else do we have here?
So it's a horse industry, but we do have evidence for several other buildings and for the fact that a lot was invested here in the first half of the 8th century by these Israelite monarchs, especially probably Jeroboam II. First of all, we have the reconstruction of the gate. We have a new gate system at Megiddo, and the gate is huge when we speak about, of course, 4 chambers, not 6, but very broad, and also incorporated into a city wall. Matt, we are dealing with this on a daily basis. We have evidence for fortifications in the Middle Bronze, construction of fortifications, and then reuse of the old Middle Bronze fortification in the Late Bronze. But in the beginning of the Iron Age, there's no fortification. The city is not fortified. And then again, in the 8th century, all of a sudden, it is surrounded by this big wall, 3.5 meters wide, of stones and bricks on top. So this is another endeavor of these kings in the 8th century. We have one administrative building, a very interesting one, in the eastern part of the mound. And it is interesting because, yet again, like in the days of the Omrides, we see there a cult room, which means that the cult of the city is not in a major temple. I mean, they repeat the situation of the Omrides. They wish to control cults. So they put the cult, they enter the cult into their administrative building. So this is another feature that we see here at Megiddo. And finally, I should say that we have this very elaborate water system, beautiful water system, perhaps signaling that these kings were aware of the fact that things look very peaceful, but there is a reason to worry. Because, this place has plenty of water, 2 springs on both sides of the tell, and people could go to the spring with their buckets and bring water. However, all this is fine as long as you are not under siege. And when somebody puts a siege on you, you don't have water, you're dead. So what they had this idea to have a fortification, and inside the fortification, cut a big shaft into the earlier layers of occupation, and then into the rock, the bedrock below us, and then cut a tunnel to the spring, tilt the tunnel a little bit inside so the water comes to the bottom of the shaft. They can pull water with buckets without the enemy, even if discovering this place, cannot climb into the city. And of course, they also camouflaged the cave with the spring. So this is one of there are several water systems like this in the country. The most well-known one is not in Israel, but in Judah, the Hezekiah Tunnel, about the same time, perhaps a little bit later, a few decades later, and there is one at Hatzor. Some people say that the idea started before, even perhaps in the 2nd millennium BC. I believe that here at Megiddo, it's an 8th century endeavor to cut this beautiful water system. So this is another structure, another item that we should speak about when we deal with 8th century Megiddo.
Right. So it's a pretty impressive city all around.
Yeah.
I suppose all of this is kind of ironic when we look at the end of this stratum, which sees the destruction of the city by the Assyrians, who were the former customers of the Israelites.
Yeah, and this happened, I think, because of a change of policy in Assyria. Assyria, became an empire, and a strong, very strong empire, a player in the Levant in the late 10th century. And it was very strong already in the 9th century. If you remember, we spoke about the Battle of Karkar, Shalmaneser III. But then they influenced this region, but they did not conquer lands in the west. And in fact, there was a tango here between the two dominant local powers, mini powers, Israel and Damascus, and the big power, in the background, Assyria. So, for instance, let me give you an example. Damascus dominated Israel in the second half of the 9th century BC. And the fact that Israel managed to recover was an outcome of pressure put by one of the Assyrian monarchs on Damascus in the days of Adad-nirari III. So there was this tango between the three of them. In any event, at a certain point, Assyria changed policy and decided really to conquer the lands and establish provinces and directly rule and even approach Egypt, for different reasons. And the northern kingdom fell victim to this change of policy of Assyria, and in 732, the entire Galilee, and specifically here, Megiddo was taken over by Tiglath-Pileser III.
So the next thing that we can look at is the city that Tiglath-Pileser III, or his successor, built here at Megiddo, which really represents the next major phase of occupation here.
This is what we are going to do next time.
Well, Israel, we're at the end, both literally and figuratively.
Not the bitter end.
Not the bitter end, of course not.
There's hope at the end.
There's always hope at the end. I hope that will be the end of our message here.
Okay.
We know that the history of Megiddo continues on into the Persian period, but we no longer have access to those stratigraphic remains. The University of Chicago peeled all of that away. So for this episode, I suggest we talk about the latest material that we can have access to. In particular, let's go back to start with to the destruction by the Assyrians, Tiglath-Pileser III, and talk about the last 2 centuries of Megiddo.
Yes, so indeed, we pull back a little bit to our previous talk about which ended with the destruction of the Northern Kingdom. 732, changing the Assyrian Empire, the Assyrian Empire becoming far more aggressive than before under Tiglath-Pileser III, and he conquers, all these territories in the north, not only here in the Northern Kingdom, also in Syria, and he takes over the Galilee part, the northern valleys included of the Northern Kingdom in 732, which means that the Northern Kingdom survives 10 or 12 more years until the capital Samaria is taken over a bit later, but this is the first blow in 732. And it is really interesting to see that there is no total destruction of the city. So here and there we have evidence for destruction, and there are other places, perhaps including here behind us, the evidence perhaps is less clear. And it should not come as a surprise, because when an empire comes to a place like this, there is a pre-plan, some sort of pre-plan. They know what they need, and why should they destroy everything if they want to exploit and to establish, a province of the empire later? So they need to keep them alive in a way. So there is so this is basically what we see. We see partial destruction of the Israelite city, and we spoke about it. And then we have the Assyrian city at Megiddo. We really don't know for the time being whether the Assyrian city was constructed right away. Let's say immediately after 732, perhaps in the time of Sargon II in the late 8th century. When exactly, we do not know, but we know that they changed the layout of Megiddo completely, and they made Megiddo the center of an administrative district, the district of Megiddo. And so what we see on the ground from the excavations of the University of Chicago is basically the plan of the entire city. And it's really fascinating, because it's different from everything that we knew before. Another revolution. We spoke during our 8 clips about revolutions in the history, I mean, layout revolutions.
Yeah.
In the history of Megiddo. This is the last one, if you wish, that we get what we describe as hippodamic plan. So this is Little Manhattan of Megiddo
Right.
in the 7th century BC. The meaning is that the streets crisscross in right angle, so and they make insula of structures, and they're all like this, like in an American city, in a downtown in an American city, and this is really fascinating. For the first time, we see something like this here in the land of Israel. So, I mean, there's a lot to speak about it, but we can just push it aside for a minute.
Sure.
And then they construct a new gate, and they really make huge fields in order to elevate the whole thing, because this is an empire coming and reorganizing Megiddo, and they construct 2 palaces. The big question is whether the 2 palaces represent one phase in the history of Assyrian Megiddo or 2 phases, whether they are from the same moment. We try to struggle with this question. Both of them are of a sort of Mesopotamian layout in a way, and you can identify definitely Assyrian features in the architecture of the palaces. Also, we, in the very beginning of our excavations here in 1994, tried to struggle with the palaces, and we published also several Assyrian-like features, even things which are completely similar to items found, in Mesopotamia, at Khorsabad, for instance, one of the important capitals of Assyria in the northeast. So this is the Assyrian city. Now the Assyrians, unfortunately, we have no indication of an Assyrian administration. This is surprising, by the way. I mean, you would have thought that you'll find some sort of a cuneiform tablet. And we have in this country cuneiform tablets of the later period, of this period. In two in Gezer, there is 1 or 2 at Hadid. There are several places, and not at Megiddo. So how to explain this? Very difficult. I am trying to find an excuse, and I see myself, in my dream, I see the commander of Assyria, of the Assyrian city, telling them, guys, we have to pull out. Time has come because we have a new enemy in the north, and we have to struggle in the north. So we evacuate the beautiful Jezreel Valley, pack all documentation. So they put everything on the back of donkeys and they go. I mean, this is the situation. Well, now, the Assyrians were here for about a century, starting 732, constructing maybe 720. The pullout, according to all scholars today, around 630 BC, 630 BC, perhaps a year or 2 later. And the pullout is interesting because it is connected to somebody, to an empire which inherits the Assyrian territories. The Egyptian empire of the old young empire of the 26th dynasty, the Said dynasty of Egypt. The first famous king is Psammetichus, of course, and then the others, and Necho is the one who is related to this place. In any event, they inherit. And the situation is interesting because, I mean, it's like the Middle East today. We in Israel are enemies with Egypt 1 year, and then after 20 years, we are friends with Egypt against somebody else, and, there are new alliances. And, all this is under the umbrella of an American empire. So things in the Middle East were the same also then, because Egypt was the enemy of Assyria and vice versa before, and Assyria even took parts of Egypt in the delta.
Right.
But then there is a new enemy, a common enemy. So they align against the common new enemy, Babylonia. So the Egyptians inherit the place peacefully from Assyria. And then there is also a Babylonian phase. So this is the background for what happens after 732, Assyria, Egypt, Babylonia.
How does this historical overview get translated to Megiddo?
to the side, to the ground.
That's right, archaeologically.
Yeah, we need to tie to the ground. And here we face a major problem. We need to reflect back on our first clip about, the introduction to Megiddo. And we said that the idea of this expedition, the program was to reinvestigate Megiddo from bedrock all the way up to the surface, including these later periods.
Right.
The problem is that the University of Chicago, when they started working here, in the first years, their idea was to peel off the site layer by layer. So, in fact, when we look at the surface of the site, also here, what the camera sees, we already miss the later phases.
Right.
So we were in a problem because we do want to have the material culture assemblages of the phases after. And there is another thing, that not only at Megiddo, in the entire north, we do not know enough about the material culture, including pottery and other items of the 7th and 6th centuries. In Judah, we know perfectly, because we have the phase between the, let's say, the Sennacherib destructions and the early 6th century, including Jerusalem destruction. But here we are in a big question mark, and this is really some sort of a lacuna, in the archaeology of Israel, in the Iron Age, and even the general picture. So we said to ourselves, we need to contribute something here, first of all, to our understanding of Megiddo, and then the border issue. So we started looking for a place. The first place was Area Q over there. Very quickly, we found out that there's nothing. It was already taken out by Chicago, and we had wonderful finds from Area Q, and many articles were written, but not on this.
Right.
And then Asaf Kleiman, who is running this area behind us, and me sat down and looked at the beautiful balloon pictures of the University of Chicago, where you can see every detail. And we noticed that there is a small hump here.
Okay.
And we said, maybe this hump preserves these later remains. Maybe they neglected, to take this out. We started excavating here. This is why we are sitting here, Matt.
I guess so.
To see this, what's behind us. So we started here in 2016 and then 18 and then now. And we indeed are lucky. We have here a wonderful sequence of the period after the destruction of Israel, possibly including the Assyrian phase, and definitely a bit later in the 7th century into the beginning of the 6th century. And we are in motion here. We are going to have more finds, and the finds are fascinating. Here we have, for a time being, 5 phases, and perhaps all 5 of them, 4 or 5 of them, belong to this post-732 situation. So this is great, with floors, material on the floors. So we will be able to use this in order to better understand Megiddo, but much more than that. We can use this in order to shed light on the archaeology, material culture, and therefore history of the entire region. Let me give you one small example. Okay. There were surveys here in the Galilee in the 70s, and the surveyor, Tzvi Gal, was a very good one, suggested, according to what he knew at that time, that basically the Galilee was deserted. People were deported, and there is a huge decline demographically and in the settlement history with the Assyrian takeover. But maybe this needs to be checked afresh.
Sure.
Asaf wants to check this afresh, and rightly so. This needs to be checked afresh according to what we see here behind us. So now, for the time being, we have also the sequence of material culture, of archaeology, after 732.
Give us a few examples of some of the interesting finds that you're referring to here.
Absolutely. So, some of the finds are not very beautiful, but important, because they see the changes, in the pottery traditions and so on. But there is one thing, one layer here. We are speaking here behind us about 5 layers. This is area X. So we have X1, X2, X3, X4, X5. X3 is extremely important because we have here a very interesting cocktail of finds. We already in 2016 identified pottery, which is described by all of us as East Greek.
Okay.
Typical of the second half of the 7th century, so between 650 and 600 BC. It's you cannot miss it once you see it. And this pottery is known from several other sites, but usually on the coast, not so much inland. And it was quite a surprise for us to see this pottery here. We carried out a neutron activation analysis of for the origin of the pottery. And the pottery comes from Miletus. So it's really East Greek in the sense of the coast of Asia Minor. Miletus is in the western coast of Asia Minor, and it is in Lydia. When we speak, when we speak about the Lydians, when we speak about, you know, pre-classical, if you wish, Greek world and Anatolia. So this you have to keep in mind, in the back of your mind, because we'll get back to it. And then in the same layer, together with the East Greek pottery, lo and behold, we have Egyptian pottery.
Ah, wow.
Yeah, so this is the what I call the wonderful cocktail. Egyptian. Think about it, Egyptian pottery with East Greek. Now, why is this so important and why is this so interesting?
Herodotus.
Exactly. We have the historical records which tell us that at that time there were Greek mercenaries serving in the Egyptian military and in the Egyptian army. So, for instance, Ashurbanipal tell us about this king of Lydia, Gyges, who sends mercenaries to Egypt. We have, by the way, evidence for these mercenaries in Egypt, in the archaeology of Egypt, which is interesting. We have, by the way, evidence from the coast of Israel, a site a little bit to the south of Tel Aviv, which is related, Metzad Chashaviyahu, which is related to this story of Egyptian forces and perhaps Greek mercenaries, Greek in the sense of Asia Minor as well.
Sure.
And then there is Herodotus, and he tells us about, of course, a bit later. Herodotus is in the 5th century, but he reflects back and tells us about the 7th century BC. And this is also interesting. And I think that these, in my opinion, there are places in the Bible where there are hints at this phenomenon of Greek mercenaries, perhaps Greek hoplites, known to the biblical author, known to the Deuteronomistic author who composes the Book of Kings. For instance, let me give you one example, the description of the armor of Goliath in the Book of Samuel, which reminds one very much of a Greek hoplite rather than a warrior of the Mycenaean times, or if you wish, or something like that. How to explain the phenomenon of East Greek pottery found here in the Levant? One way is to say that this is simply trade, right?
Yeah.
But there is another voice because of Metzad Chashaviyahu, this fort south of us near Tel Aviv, and because of other reasons, to associate this East Greek pottery with these Greek mercenaries in the service of Egypt in the late 7th century BC. So things start to close here. I mean, in the geopolitical picture.
This isn't normally my thing to immediately jump to the biblical text, but I'm a little bit tempted to connect this Greek mercenary pottery, Egyptian pottery, to the story of Josiah in the Bible.
Yes, my dear Matt, there's no way to avoid this. There's this fascinating tradition in the Bible, in 2 places, of the killing of King Josiah of Judah, here at Megiddo, in 609 BC, by King Necho of Egypt of the 6th dynasty. I mean, we are in the same slot chronologically, exactly. And which means in the late 7th century. We were speaking about the late 7th century. Now, this tradition is important. Sometimes I'm telling people who come with me here to Megiddo, forget about Solomon, forget about, I don't know, Thutmose III or Biridia, king of Megiddo in the late Bronze Age. The most important single event at Megiddo from our culture point of view in the 21st century is this moment in 609, because it has to do with the beginning of eschatology and messianism in Judeo-Christian tradition. So this is really important. So here's the story. 2 stories, in fact.
Okay.
One in the Book of Kings, one in the Book of Chronicles. Now, in a situation, and they tell different stories. The Book of Kings is very cool. It says, if you read it very carefully, Necho summons Josiah to Megiddo, something goes wrong, and he kills him. He executes Josiah on the spot here at Megiddo in 609. Chronicles gives us a story about a battle, that Josiah came with an army and there was a battle with Necho, and Josiah died in battle and was taken to be buried in the tombs of the Davidites in Jerusalem.
Sounds more heroic, I suppose.
Yeah, sounds very heroic, but you know, Judah could not really put a fight with an Egyptian empire of the 26th dynasty. And also, more important perhaps, Chronicles was put in writing late, some say 4th or 3rd centuries. I would say that parts of all Chronicles which do not appear in Kings, perhaps even in the 2nd century BC, completely different ideology, completely different needs to explain things.
Right.
So we need to stick to Kings. Josiah comes here, executed on the spot. So this is interesting, really, and connects now, first of all, to the ground.
You find
Maybe.
Josiah?
Not yet. Maybe connects to the ground. I'll tell you why. You remember we spoke 3 minutes ago, about this cocktail of Egyptian pottery with East Greek pottery, perhaps related to mercenaries in the Egyptian army here at Megiddo, and we are exactly in the slot which fits 609 BC, one way or the other, apparently. We need to check this still further, but I mean, as a framework, I would say. And in the Bible, there are several hints in Ezekiel and in Jeremiah that Greek soldiers, one way or the other, were associated with the killing of Josiah at Megiddo. And even perhaps if we understand well, and it's very vague, there is this chapter in Jeremiah specifically referring to Lydians.
Okay.
And also the tradition of Gog and Magog is, perhaps related to Giges and therefore to Lydia and therefore to the mercenaries. I mean, it takes a lot of ifs and it takes a lot of interpretation. And we scholars are running away sometimes from interpretation, but sometimes you have to say to yourself, wait, hey, say the things and then we'll see.
Right.
Okay? So we are saying the things. So perhaps we have here the connection. We wrap it up as a connection, I mean, of Josiah being killed because of something went wrong. He came here. He was probably asked to swear alliance to the new suzerain, Necho here after the Assyrian pullout. He had other ideas. He did not understand well the geopolitical situation here. This happens a lot in the Middle East, of not understanding the bigger picture. He made a mistake and he paid with his life for the mistake.
So you mentioned that this death of Josiah was so important to modern Judeo-Christian thought and culture. What did you mean by that?
Yes, I mean by that this happened in 609 BC. Already as early as the later layer in the book of Zechariah in the Hebrew Bible, there is reference which perhaps speaks about an eschatological battle. The forces, what is eschatology? The forces of God will fight the forces of evil. The forces of God will prevail and we will all be redeemed, So this is basic in Judaism, in early Judaism. You see this very clearly, perhaps starting indeed with Zechariah, post-exilic Zechariah, and then in Apocrypha of the late 3rd, 2nd century BC into the scrolls. And then, of course, we come to another point, which is the book of Revelations in the New Testament. So there's this idea that I would translate it in the following way. I would interpret it or understanding in the following way. There is the idea of Armageddon. Okay, Armageddon is the Greek corruption of Har Megiddo, the Mound of Megiddo. So hey, all of a sudden, Megiddo, that is already deserted for several centuries in the time that John of Patmos is active in Patmos and writing Revelations in the 1st century, So then all of a sudden, Megiddo is back to life, as the centerpiece of eschatology and messianism. So what's going on? Did he invent it? No, he did not. So perhaps the tradition goes from a short while after the death of Josiah. Josiah is described in the Bible as the most righteous of all kings of Judah and Israel combined. He is the absolute, the most righteous monarch. He is more righteous than David, mind you. Okay, if you look at the details, David is. Would you marry your daughter to David?
No.
Okay, but Josiah perhaps.
Sure.
But Josiah, they say that he walked in the path of the God of Israel, without striding to the right and without striding to the left. And they even make some sort of a comparison of him to Moses, the only king. So perhaps the idea is the following, that in the future, from the place where the most righteous king of all Davidites, of the lineage of David, of the dynasty of David, died, from the same place, in the same place, there will be an eschatological battle. The forces of God will prevail, and a new Davidite will emerge to help to save us all, to redeem us all. So if you remember, we started this episode and I told you that I'm going to give you some hope.
Doesn't sound very hopeful. So
it is hopeful. At the end, things will be okay.
Okay.